Chapter 222. This is the last chapter of this volume. I have something to do tomorrow, and then I have to sort out the plot of the next volume, which is also the last volume, so there won't be any updates. This volume was well written. In terms of the overall plot, I liked the part about the Wunshui Tangs the most. It was written with the wuxia style that I liked. In the past, when Wenruyan wrote about Xiao Qiushui, as well as when he wrote about heroes later on, he was most curious about what kind of place the Tang family was. He was curious about what kind of people the Tang Old Master and Old Madam Tang looked like. In the end, he waited for more than 20 years, but he still did not see any of them. He probably would not be able to see them either. The Tang family I wrote about was, of course, different from the Tang family in the wuxia novels, especially the Tang family written by Wenruyan. The Tang family in the novels was more like the masterminds behind the scenes in those conspiracy theories. In terms of viewing effects, my favorite was, of course, Su Yurong and Chen Chongsheng's twin, sword harmony after coming out of seclusion. Some readers did not understand why the Having Blade needed two people to be together. My explanation was that this wasn't a Having Blade. It was a very complicated structure. Secondly, their realms and talents were actually not as good as Zhou Xian's. The most important reason was that he really wanted to write harmonious swords. Back then, when I saw Zhang Danfeng and Yun Lei, I felt so good. Then, when I saw their master, I felt even better. All right, I'll control my emotions. Finally, I must say that in this volume, I wrote the best and most satisfied with the death of Bianghong and Wu Qiongbai. In the beginning, the love and dislike of the characters in the book are controlled and guided by oneself. In the end, it is their own charm or anti-charm. The three of them walked out of the imperial city. After walking past the half-collapsed Whalefall platform, Qin Chongsheng suddenly stopped. Whose child is it in her womb? Hearing this, Tang 36 thought of the silence in the hall and Su Yurong's reaction. He was shocked and instinctively prepared to run away. Su Yurong glanced at him and said, "You think too much." Qin Chongsheng also noticed the change in Tang 36's expression and shook his head helplessly. Many people had died in this battle, including Bianghong, Wu Qiongbai, and the two angels of sacred light. What Qin Chongsheng couldn't forget was a life that many people couldn't even remember. It was the child in Madame Mu's arms. As far as he was concerned, the child was the most innocent victim. Or perhaps it was because it reminded him of his past. Su Yurong understood where his question came from and explained that the White Emperor clan needed 5 years of pregnancy before they could give birth. Qin Chongsheng was stunned. He finally understood why Luo Luo said she was the same age as him, but she looked so small. So the age she mentioned was 1 year old. Outside the imperial city, the leader of the Bear tribe, the leader of the Sher clan, and some other important figures of the demi-human race were waiting for them. Outside of the White Emperor's line of sight, they were very willing to express their goodwill to Qin Chongsheng and repair the relationship between the two sides. However, in the end, there were still some misgivings. Not long after, the crowd dispersed, and the front of the imperial city became desolate. Qin Chongsheng turned his head and looked at the observation platform that was like a small black dot high up. He didn't say anything. Of course, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. During those nights when he was breaking through the formation in Starfall mountain range, he'd thought about a great deal, and he'd already faintly understood exactly what was going on. So when he used the South Stream Temple Sword Array to break the seal, the mountain collapsed and the White Emperor reappeared in the world. He had immediately turned and left. Seeing that the White Emperor was still alive was just a confirmation, but he did not want to see him, much less speak to him, because he felt somewhat nauseated. The White Emperor was not dead, nor was he unconscious. On the night before the heavenly selection ceremony, the Xiong clan leader had come to the Starfall mountain range and naturally sensed his true will. Madame Mu knew that the Xiong clan leader had faked his allegiance to her, and it was from that night that she began to suspect the White Emperor. But she did not change her mind and continued to carry out her plan. She understood the White Emperor far too well. She knew that, as long as he could stay out of this matter, he would agree to her actions. But no one could have expected that Chen Chongqing would go to the Starfall mountain range to rescue the White Emperor. Those nights of breaking the formation and rescuing the White Emperor had actually been a form of coercion. What compelled one was not riches and honor, but firmness and persistence. In the end, the White Emperor was forced out of the mountain range by Chen Chongqing. Shang Xingzhou had told him the method to break the formation through Su Yurong and then Xiaoda. After seeing all living beings, the White Emperor had to make a decision. Based on this, he truly had lost to the master and disciple, Shang Xingzhou and Qin Chongqing. Tang 36 recalled the sight of the Li Palace's grand array being destroyed, thought of the demon lord walking out of the darkness and the angel of sacred light in the sky, and said with lingering fear, "Fortunately, all the schemes failed in the end, or else I really don't know what sort of conclusion awaited us." Qin Chongqing said nothing. He did not agree with Tang 36's view. Who can say that the White Emperor was truly defeated? The demon race lost 2 angels of sacred light, and the human race similarly lost 2 experts of the divine domain. Shang Xingzhou suffered significant injuries. The Xiang clan leader was unjustly killed, the Xiang clan was destroyed, and the Council of Elders was severely weakened. In the next 200 years, no one in the demi-human domain could threaten him, and the relationship between Qin Chongqing and Luo Luo could no longer be torn apart. Once she succeeded to the throne, the demi-humans would no longer have to worry about the threat of the human race. And for so many benefits, he only needed to pay the price of a wife. Su Yurong paused, then added, and he didn't like it. Tang 36 suddenly felt the wind get colder and colder. Only then did he realize that he was already out of the city gate, at the ferry on the shore. Xianyuan Pa, the people of the Tang clan, and the priests of the Orthodoxy had been waiting here for a very long time. The howling cold wind on the river turned everyone's breaths into pillars of frost. The scene was rather spectacular. After the blizzard, the temperature of White Emperor City had not risen. The wind came from the river, but it actually came from the western sea on the other side of the mountains. The west wind was as cold as an icy blade, but it made people's faces flush and heat up like the strongest wine. Chen Chongqing turned his head back to the imperial city, thinking of the last few days of the people in this story, of the White Emperor and Madame Mu. Will we really become this kind of people? By the lake in the Orthodox Academy and by the riverbank in Winshui City a few days ago, he had asked this question. In the past, Tang 36 would always give a very clear answer, but today he was silent. Qin Chongqing thought of Bianghong and Wu Qiongbai, and then he thought of another important question. If your wife treats you extremely well, but has an extremely bad personality and is even a great villain, what will you do? This question had been raised by Bianghong. Xianyuan thought of those days, his expression a little gloomy. Su Yurong calmly gazed at him and asked, "If it were you, what would you do?" Chen Chongqing very seriously thought this over, then replied, "I would advise you, stop you from continuing your evil ways, and guard your side for the rest of your life." Tang 36 asked, "Just like Bianghong?" Qin Chongqing thought it over, then shook his head. "I can't do it." Su Yurong replied, "I also don't want it." Tang 36 asked, "If it were you encountering this problem?" Su Yurong thought for a while, then said, "I would kill him, and then I would follow him in death." This answer, especially this kind of casual feeling, made Xianyuan Pa, who was about to speak, so scared that he didn't dare to open his mouth. Truly worthy of being a child taught by the divine empress, Tang 36 sighed, then changed the topic. "I think there's something wrong with all of you." Surprised, Qin Chongqing asked, "What do you think we should do?" "All of you say that I'm like Su Li, so my style of doing things is naturally of that school." Tang 36 replied, "What can we do?" "Do nothing. Isn't it fun to be great evildoers together? Chun Chongqing felt that these words were very inappropriate. Just when he was about to say something, he suddenly heard the lively sounds of ceremonial music in the distance. This music was very cheerful, and one could even hear the occasional firecrackers. Some family was probably holding a wedding. So many things had happened, and Madame Wu had just died. Anyone who dared to hold a wedding at this time was either extremely stupid or extremely powerful. The family holding the wedding today belonged to neither of these two categories. No one had come to stop them because this family was holding a wedding and the officiator had a rather special status. Xian Yuan said to Tang 36, the officiator was originally the principal, but now I'm taking his place. Chun Chongqing replied, I'm in a hurry to leave. The Archbishop of the Western Wastes and several cardinals had also come to bid farewell, preparing to attend the wedding. Tang 36 was even more confused at the situation, thinking, just what is going on here? Xian Yuan explained the story to him. The two getting married today were a young man and woman who had been watching the heavenly selection ceremony in front of the imperial city a few days ago. The young man was a Bear tribe laborer from the lower city's pine paths, while the young woman was a noble lady from the upper city. Logically speaking, given the vast difference in status, they should have never gotten to know each other, much less gotten married. The problem was that on that day, Chun Chongqing had engaged in a fierce battle with the demon lord on the observation platform, causing a massive rock to collapse from the Whalefall platform. At the final moment, the Bear tribe laborer had protected the noble lady. Even so, they would still have died, just like those several hundred people on the plaza who had not been able to escape in time. Fortunately, Chun Chongqing's group of swords had chopped the rock into powder, and a beautiful snowfall had fallen in front of the imperial city. No one had died, and the emotion quickly transformed into love, surpassing many other things to bring about today's wedding. They all say that it might have something to do with me proposing the marriage, Xian Yuan said, but I feel that the woman's family has a very good attitude. The people in the tribe are overthinking it. Tang 36 said, if you weren't the one representing the husband's family to propose, would the woman's family have a good attitude? Speaking of which, why did you get involved in this matter? Xian Yuan replied, we're all tribesmen, and Huji's beef buns are really delicious. I forgot to mention, the groom is a helper at the Huji's bun shop. On that day, if he hadn't risked his life to throw out the shopkeeper and the chef, we wouldn't have been able to eat these buns anymore. Tang 36 laughed. That's too exaggerated. What kind of bun could be so delicious? Chun Chongqing did not laugh. He seriously said, that bun really is delicious. The Huji's bun shop in the Pine Paths was not far from the Celestial Tree Temple, so it was naturally not far from Xian Yuan Po's home. Byonghong had loved the buns from this shop, but alas, he had not been able to eat a hot one until his death. The mood became rather gloomy. Tang 36 had heard Chun Chongqing speak of Byonghong's death and vaguely understood. Xian Yuan bid farewell to Chun Chongqing and the others. Chun Chongqing said, let's meet again when we return to the Orthodox Academy. Xian Yuan nodded and walked with the bishops to the place where the ceremonial music was being played. Chun Chongqing fell quiet for a while as he watched the firecrackers fly through the air, then said, it's a good thing. Yes, there are still many good things in the world. Tang 36 said, this being the case, who says that we'll definitely become people like the White Emperor couple. Su Yurong gave a faint smile, saying nothing. As the rays of the sun shone down, the temperature finally rose. The west wind gradually warmed, no longer as cold and fierce as before. With a cry, the white crane left the ground. The snow trembled as a black-clothed girl landed on the shore. Confused, she asked, why are you in such a rush to leave? Because Chun Chongqing had received a letter. It was a letter from the capital. Someone in the capital was about to get married. He was invited to attend the wedding, and he was also asked to preside over the wedding. Chun Chongqing could choose not to participate in the wedding in White Emperor City, but he had to participate in the wedding in the capital. and he knew that whether he was willing or not, he could not escape from this task. Just like back then, whether he was willing or not, she had still climbed into his bed. End of the 6th volume. To be continued. Chapter 223. After Zhong, Hui succeeded in comprehending the monolith. He disappeared without a trace, only leaving behind a sentence of leaving first and Chen Changsheng, who was standing on the mountain path. In the eyes of others, Chen Changsheng's current figure was somewhat lonely, although he himself didn't feel this way. The crowd looked at him and thought with slight mockery. The stone tablets of the mausoleum of books really were fair. No one could be lucky forever. Some people thought this wasn't enough. They still wanted to sprinkle salt on Chen Changsheng's wounds. The scholar from Scholartree Manor in front of the monolith hut looked at him and sneered. Senior's words before he left were spoken indifferently, but in my opinion they were a bit too modest. Although he was only a step ahead, with this step, the difference is more than 1,000 li. This sentence was meant to mock Chen Changsheng, but it also included Go Hanshi. Guan Fei raised his eyebrows and was about to explode, but he still couldn't beat Tang 36. He looked at the scholar from Scholartree Manor and mocked. Why don't you leave first? Where was he going? To reincarnate? Why are you in such a hurry? The scholar from Scholartree Manor was infuriated by these words, and Ji Jin's complexion instantly darkened. His fingers stiffened, and he almost pulled out a strand of his beard. Mr. Nianguang and the other monument guardians walked over from the crowd. They looked at Tang 36 and shouted in a deep voice, "Don't be rude! If this continues, no one will be able to protect you." Tang 36 looked at him and sneered. "I told you last night I can't hit you. What can you do to me?" Mr. Nianguang solemnly said, "We monolith guardians have the responsibility of maintaining order when viewing the monoliths. If you continue to cause trouble, I will personally send a letter to the Academy and ask the Orthodoxy to expel you from the mausoleum of books." Tang 36 looked at him as if he was looking at an idiot. He pointed at Chen Changsheng, who was beside him, and said, "You really are a group of muddle-headed old people. Do you know who he is? In the imperial palace, in front of thousands of people, His Holiness the Pope had held his hand. Countless people in the capital had suspected that he was the illegitimate son of the bishop. Proposed to the Orthodoxy? The Li Palace will listen to you. I'll cut off my head for you." Mr. Nianguang was infuriated by these words and shouted, "If the Li Palace is truly so protective, I will definitely have the Academy demand an explanation." Tang 36 was also angry and shouted, "Your school? You should ask the bishops, who gives the temple seminary 1/3 of its annual budget. The reason you were able to eat and wait for death in the mausoleum of books for so many years is all because of my family's support. You disobeyed the Orthodoxy's orders to protect Chen Changsheng, disobeyed Temple Seminary's interests to protect me. You want to stand up for the Southerners and even came to scare me. What sort of reasoning is this?" Nianguang was so angry that his entire body was shaking. He pointed at him and wanted to scold him, but in the end he just waved his sleeves angrily and left. The area around the monolith hut was completely silent. Whether it was the newcomers that had entered the mausoleum this year or the old people that had entered the mausoleum in the past, they all stared at Tang 36 in a daze, wondering just what kind of person he was. Because Zhong Hui was the first to comprehend the tablets, Tang 36 was in a bad mood. He looked at the crowd and yelled, "What are you looking at? I've never seen such a rich person. The Wenshui Tangs, are they really that rich?" Guan Fei Bai and the other two looked at each other, speechless. They had all been born into poverty, and their years of cultivation in the Mount Li Sword sect were extremely austere. Even though Qi Jian was the beloved last disciple, raised by the sect master as a child, he had never lived a life of luxury. It was truly hard to imagine that such a person existed in this world. In terms of money, the youths of Mount Li were truly ignorant. Speaking of which, Tang Tang is so rich and has always been so arrogant. Why isn't he particularly annoying? Qi Jian asked, somewhat puzzled. Guan Feibai remembered how the girls of the 13 divisions of Radiant Green and Holy Maiden Peak looked at Tang 36 passionately. Perhaps there was a reason, but he couldn't say it in front of his junior. At this moment, a youngster walked towards them. Guan Feibai and the other two greeted him and smiled. It was obvious that they were familiar with each other, especially Liang Ban, who was usually very dull, actually took the initiative to greet him. He even patted the youngster's shoulder, seeming to be very intimate. Go Hanshi introduced him to Qin Chongsheng. This is my third junior, Liang Xiao. Qin Chongsheng now knew that this youngster was the third law of the Divine State's 7 laws, Liang Xiao. Liang Xiao had always been ranked third on the proclamation of Azure Clouds. It wasn't until this year that he was pushed down to 4th by Luo. Qin Chongsheng knew his name because he was first upon the first banner in last year's grand examination. Thinking about how this person was standing in the crowd and no one noticed him, he felt that what Ji Jin and Zhong Hui said last night was very reasonable. In a place like the Mausoleum of Books where heroes gathered, first upon the first banner in the grand examination was indeed not special. Liang Xiao greeted Qin Chongsheng with an indifferent expression, as if he didn't like to talk. Then he looked towards Go Hanshi and said, Senior, 2 days ago I was meditating in front of the East Pavilion monolith, so I didn't have the time to find you. Go Hanshi said, Of course viewing the monoliths and cultivating is more important. Since we've come to the Mausoleum of Books, there will be a time to meet. Qin Chongsheng remembered that Go Hanshi had said yesterday that he would introduce someone to him. Now that he thought about it, it should be this youngster. Qi Jian heard the words East Pavilion Monolith and said in surprise, East Pavilion Monolith, that's the 6th monolith. Third senior, you're really amazing. Liang Xiao nodded his head slightly. Although his name had the word Xiao in it, his face didn't have the slightest hint of a smile. He seemed to be even colder and more arrogant than Guan Feibai. Go Hanshi looked at him and smiled. Since you've already seen the East Pavilion monolith, breaking through the realm isn't something that happened recently. Liang Xiao said to Go Hanshi respectfully, Half a year ago I entered Ethereal Opening and then I didn't make any progress. I'm very ashamed, so I didn't send a letter back. Liang Ban, who laughed honestly, That's enough. Go Hanshi said to Qin Chongsheng, 3rd junior and 5th junior are twins. Tang 36's gaze moved back and forth between Liang Xiao and Liang Ban, whose faces. He asked confusedly, Why does 5th brother look older than 3rd brother? Liang Xiao heard this and turned his head, giving him a cold stare. Tang 36 stared back. Qi Jian said, 3rd senior, he's just this kind of person. Just ignore him. Liang Xiao really didn't pay attention to Tang 36 and turned around. Zhixiu looked at Qi Jian with a strange expression. Qi Jian felt his gaze, and as if he had been stung by a scorpion, he quickly hid behind Liang Ban, who. Go Hanshi explained a few words, and Qin Chongsheng realized that the 5th law, Liang Ban, who was the older brother, Liang Xiao, who was ranked higher, was actually the younger brother. Then he remembered that Liang Xiao had previously said that he broke through half a year ago. Only then did he realize that this person had already entered Ethereal Opening. If that's the case, when he leaves the Mausoleum of Books, he will leave the Proclamation of Azure Sky and enter the Proclamation of Golden Distinction? Please tell Princess Luo that I won't be 4th on the Proclamation of Azure Sky. Liang Xiao looked at Qin Chongsheng with an indifferent expression. Then, without waiting for Qin Chongsheng to respond, without waiting for Tang 36 to speak, he turned to Go Hanshi and sternly said, Senior, although we and Skullatree Manor are both from the south, Mountly is still Mountly. How can we fall behind others? Go Hanshi said, I have my own score. You should meditate and observe the monolith. You only have 1 month before leaving the mausoleum. You should treasure your time. Liang Xiao said no more. Just as he had said, although the ranking on the monolith in front of the Mausoleum of Books had long since been destroyed by Zhou Tong sent by the Divine Empress. Things like competitiveness or glory could not be forcefully erased from people's hearts. The speed at which one comprehended the monoliths, as well as the number of heavenly tome monoliths comprehended in the end, were still incorporeal rankings in people's hearts. This year, there was no peerless genius that comprehended the reflecting monolith on the first day, and no one was able to successfully comprehend the monolith on the second day. However, Zhong Hui was able to comprehend the monolith on the morning of the third day, which was already quite good. At this time, the monolith viewers that had entered the Mausoleum of Books in previous years already knew of Chen Changsheng and Go Hansher's identities. They knew that they were this year's first and second place in the grand examination. Moreover, the discussions outside the mausoleum had already spread to this place. The reputation of the two being well-versed in the Taoist canon was extremely well known, so it naturally attracted a lot of attention. Even now, the two of them still had no way of comprehending the first heavenly tome monolith, which inevitably led to some discussion. After Wang Jitsa, the only people who dared to claim to be well-versed in the Taoist canon were these two. I didn't think that today they would actually be defeated by a scholar from Scholatry Manor. Rumors are often untrue. What well-versed in the Taoist canon, reaching ethereal opening at a young age? Looking at it now, I'm afraid that those rumors were a bit exaggerated. The monolith viewers went to their respective monoliths to comprehend. Liang Xiaoxiao had also left. The crowd in front of the reflecting monolith gradually dispersed, and the mountain forest gradually became quiet. Chun Changsheng walked to the front of the monolith hut and looked at the black monolith. After a long period of silence, he suddenly asked, "How did he disappear?" Could it be that behind the heavenly tome monoliths is a miniature world? Tang 36 and the others saw that he was silently viewing the monoliths and thought that he was thinking about something important. Who would have thought that he was actually thinking about this question? They could not help but be speechless. Go Hansher said, "It said that the heavenly tome monoliths are fragments of some miniature world. Now they are scattered in the real world. The space has already been annihilated, but these fragments are still connected. It can also be understood that each monolith is a door, but this door cannot lead to other places. It can only lead to other doors, which are other heavenly tome monoliths. Moreover, the order between the monoliths will never change." Chen Changsheng said, "So that's how it is. No wonder it's said that the Mausoleum of Books only has one path. But how can the heavenly tome monoliths determine whether the key in the hands of the monolith viewer is correct? The Taoist canons did not record how to go from one heavenly tome monolith to the next. When those sages who had once viewed the monoliths and comprehended the Tao recorded their days in the Mausoleum of Books, they also did not mention these details. This was because, in the eyes of cultivators, this was all common knowledge, and there was absolutely no need to explain it. Chun Changsheng knew countless obscure knowledge in the 3,000 scriptures of the Tao, but he was somewhat lacking in common knowledge regarding the world and cultivation. This was because he was self-taught. Go Hansher said, "The heavenly tomes cannot be comprehended. The heavenly tome monoliths themselves have many mystical or incomprehensible aspects. How to determine whether the interpretation of the monolith inscriptions is correct can never be determined by the cultivator themselves. Neither the monolith viewer nor the spectator can do this. Only the heavenly tome monoliths can determine it themselves." Determine it themselves? Chen Changsheng did not understand and repeated. Go Hansher said, "The monolith viewer is in contact with the heavenly tome monoliths. If the heavenly tome monoliths feel that you understand, then you truly understand." Chun Changsheng thought of the famous description of the heavenly Tao in the Taoist canons. Profound within profound, the door of all wonders. If the heavenly tome monoliths were a door, then what sort of world of wonders was behind the door? Seeing his pensive appearance in front of the monolith, Tang 36 and the others continued to be speechless. Zhong Hui had already comprehended the first heavenly tone monolith, but he was still interested in these minor details. Could it be that he was not anxious? Qin Changsheng suddenly thought of something and said, "I have to hurry back." Tang 36 asked in surprise, "What is it?" Chen Changsheng was somewhat anxious. He said, "You dragged me out in such a hurry that I forgot the stove was still boiling water. What if it dries up?" Chapter 224. Seeing Chen Changsheng's hurried figure on the mountain path, Tang 36 was somewhat confused. Zhixia was the same. His usually expressionless face now showed some doubt. He silently thought, could it be that Chen Changsheng was trying to escape from something? But thinking about the ups and downs of the Orthodox Academy in the past year, Chen Changsheng didn't seem like such a person. Go Hanshi withdrew his gaze from the mountain path, no longer thinking about Chen Changsheng's plans. He said to Qi Jian and the other two juniors, "Last night, I only let you look at Senior Sunmei's notes because I didn't want you to be distracted. After looking at the notes, you should know that there are many ways to comprehend the heavenly tome monoliths. So what do you think?" Guan Fei Bai thought for a while, then said, "In Senior Sunmei's notes, just the reflecting monolith alone has left behind over 10 different ways of thinking. After careful consideration, they're all extremely reasonable. It's just that our Mount Li sword sect is located in the south, so I'm still used to using my spiritual sense to comprehend the monolith's meaning. Give me some more time, and I should be able to completely comprehend this monolith." Qi Jian and Liang Ban, who also had a similar opinion, but Go Hanshi said, "If you can completely forget the ideas or experiences in Senior Sunmei's notes, then perhaps you can comprehend the monolith." After saying this, he naturally thought of his conversation with Chen Changsheng last night. In his view, Chen Changsheng clearly understood the principles within, which was why he chose to search for the true meaning within the changes. It was just that this method of comprehending the monolith was a bit too new. To create a new path, it really wasn't an easy matter. Guan Fei Bai and the others heard his words and were somewhat shocked. After calming their minds, they vaguely understood their senior's meaning. They walked to the front of the monolith hut and each found a slightly flat surface to sit on. Looking at the dark monolith under the eaves, they began to silently engrave all the words in Sun Mei's notes onto the monolith, then gradually drove them out of their minds. Zhixia and Tang 36 looked at each other and followed them. Dozens of students who had just entered the mausoleum of books this year to view the monoliths also sat cross-legged in front of the monolith hut. Only Go Hanshi stood in the distance, looking at the distant mountains calmly and silently. No one knew what he was thinking. Time slowly passed, but the area in front of the monolith hut remained silent the entire time. At some point, the oil lamp hanging on the tree next to the hut had been taken away by someone. The tree branch, which had once again become relaxed, gently swayed in the spring wind. Occasionally, it would bounce off into the blue sky. Occasionally, a green leaf would fall from the branch and drift with the wind to the front of the hut. Qi Jian suddenly opened his eyes. He picked up a green leaf that had fallen on his thin shoulder, then stood up. After a moment of hesitation, he walked into the monolith hut. They who lived in the grass hut left behind by Sun Mei were the people that the students paid the most attention to. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the title of the Grass Hut 7. In that silent period of time, who knew how many gazes fell on them from time to time? Seeing that Qi Jian seemed to have the intention of comprehending the monoliths, the quiet hut couldn't help but become slightly restless. Zhong Hui was the first person to comprehend the monoliths. Everyone wanted to know who would be the second. The vast majority of people believed that it would be Go Hanshi because Chen Changsheng was not present. Then, if they counted down, it should be Zhixia or perhaps Guan Fei Bai or Liang Banhu, who had cultivated for a relatively longer period of time. No one would have thought that it would actually be the young Qi Jian. Qi Jian walked in front of the reflecting monolith and turned his head to glance outside the monolith hut. His young and tender face was filled with uncertainty. Go Hanshi stood under a distant pine tree. He did not say anything, but a smile appeared on his face. As a result, Qi Jian also began to smile. The uncertainty on his face disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only joy. He took another step towards the reflecting monolith, then carefully extended his right hand and placed it on the edge of the monolith. He did not touch any of the lines on the surface of the monolith. A cool breeze blew over from the cliff behind the monolith, causing the hair by Qi Jian's face to gently flutter. It swept across his clear and elegant features, and then he disappeared from where he was standing. There was a deathly stillness in front of the monolith hut. The sounds of discussion that had just occurred disappeared without a trace, just like Qi Jian's thin and small figure. The second person to pass through the reflecting monolith had just so casually appeared. Before the crowd had time to recover from their shock, they saw Guan Feibai stand up and walk towards the monolith hut. Compared to Qi Jian, this divine state's 4 laws, who were famous for being cold and arrogant, was truly casual, even if he was facing the divine, heavenly tone monoliths. His right hand landed on the reflecting monolith. He did not even glance at where his hand had landed. It was as if he had very casually patted the railing, preparing to chat about today's weather. There was another cool breeze, a flash of clear light, and then it disappeared. His figure also disappeared. What caused those people in front of the monolith hut, who were still bitterly pondering the true meaning of the monolith inscriptions, to be incomparably shocked, and even somewhat helpless, was that Liang Banhu also stood up and walked towards the monolith hut. This disciple of the divine state's 7 laws, who was the most low-key and also the most taciturn, first carefully tidied up his clothes, then respectfully bowed. Only then did he very seriously place his hand on the monolith. Without any pause, without any interval, the 3 disciples of the Mount Li Sword sect successively comprehended the reflecting monolith and proceeded to the second heavenly tone monolith. After a moment of silence, several sighs arose in front of the monolith hut. The sighs were filled with envy, but also with despair. The talent of cultivators was truly different. The Mount Li Sword sect was truly exceptional. Compared to Zhong Hui's breakthrough of the reflecting monolith in the morning, the 3 disciples of the Mount Li Sword sect did not have such a large entourage. They also did not have any seniors of the sect standing guard at the side, nor did they break into ethereal opening. They only stood up in a very ordinary manner, walked into the hut, and then disappeared from everyone's eyes. This was truly doing as one wished. Of the 4 people who had entered the Mount Li Sword sect, only Go Hanshi was still standing. Many people subconsciously looked towards him, feeling that it was somewhat strange. His cultivation and knowledge far surpassed his 3 junior brothers. So why was his speed at comprehending the monolith slower than his 3 junior brothers? Some people guessed at something. Seeing Go Hanshi finally leave the pine tree and walk towards the monolith, they confirmed that their guesses were not wrong. Go Hanshi walked in front of the reflecting monolith. He did not close his eyes to meditate, nor did he look at the lines on the monolith. He continued to look at the distant mountain, and then his right hand descended. The cool breeze rose again, and the birds in the forest flapped their wings and flew away. His figure had already disappeared from the hut. Only now did everyone understand that Go Hanshi had long since comprehended the reflecting monolith. He had only been waiting for his 3 junior brothers. In other words, as long as he was willing, wouldn't he be able to easily become the first person to comprehend the monolith in this year's Mausoleum of Books? Everyone thought back to the morning when Zhong Hui had successfully comprehended the monolith, and excitement and pride on the faces of the people of Scholatry Manor, and they could not help but feel that this scene was rather embarrassing. At this moment, the 2 young scholars from Scholatry Manor that remained in front of the hut had truly become embarrassed. Go Hanshi had been able to comprehend the monolith without going because he wanted to be of the same sect. But what about Qin Changsheng? Everyone very naturally thought of this question. Was he like Go Hanshi and had long since comprehended this heavenly tome monolith? If this was the case, then who was he waiting for? Or was it, as Zhong Hui had said, that he really did not have enough talent to comprehend the monolith? The sounds of discussion gradually rose, then gradually died down. Not too long after, Zhuang Huanyu arrived in front of the monolith hut. As this year's strongest student of the Heavenly Academy, many people recognized him. But for some reason, after entering the mausoleum of books, he had disappeared. No one knew where he went or what he was doing. Even in the morning, when Zhong Hui broke through and comprehended the monolith, he did not appear. Seeing him now, everyone could not help but be somewhat surprised. Zhuang Huanyu's clothes were covered in grass and leaves, as if he had spent 2 nights in the forest. He was in a somewhat sorry state, but his expression was extremely calm. Between his brows, there was a faint sense of self-confidence. Tang 36 looked at him and said, "You didn't go to the little green forest building?" The 6 ivies were originally in the capital and were extremely close to the mausoleum of books, so it was easy to obtain many conveniences. As the most famous school in the Zhou dynasty in recent years, the Heavenly Academy would naturally make proper arrangements for the students of the academy that came to comprehend the monoliths. The little green forest building was the dormitory for the Heavenly Academy in the mausoleum of books. The other academies, like the Temple Seminary or Star Caesar Academy, also had similar arrangements. I didn't go to the little green forest building because I didn't have the time. Zhuang Huanyu brushed off the dust and grass on his body and directly walked into the monolith hut. Tang 36 looked at his back and said, "Even if you succeed in comprehending the monolith, you can only be ranked 6th. Is there a need to go through so much trouble?" Zhuang Huanyu's right hand stopped above the monolith. He said, "But at least I'm in front of Qin Changsheng, no?" After saying this, his right hand fell. Not long after, Su Mou stood up and walked into the monolith hut, becoming the 7th person this year to successfully comprehend the monolith. Seeing one person after another successfully comprehend the monolith, how could a proud person like Tang 36 not be anxious? Especially when Su Mou's ranking on the proclamation of Azure Clouds was already behind him. This made him even more anxious. But in the next moment, he came to his senses, slightly creased his brow, and closed his eyes, no longer thinking about these matters. His mind wandered, no longer on the monolith. For a moment, it seemed as if he was really about to fall asleep. When he woke up, dusk had already arrived. The sunset filled the sky, and the spring forest of the mausoleum of books was burning. He stood up and walked into the monolith hut. As he passed by Zhixiu, he said, "Tell Qin Changxing that he doesn't need to wait for me to eat tonight." Walking in front of the monolith, he happily laughed and opened his arms to give the cold monolith a big hug. Comprehending the heavenly tome monoliths would give one an indescribable feeling. To cultivators, this kind of feeling was even more delicious than dragon marrow, even more enchanting than the stars. It was an extremely satisfying feeling. The vast majority of people who had comprehended the first heavenly tome monolith and then arrived in front of the second monolith would not become lost in it, unaware of the passage of time. Tang 36 was very clear that he had no way of resisting this intoxicating feeling. Tonight, he would definitely sleep in the embrace of the second heavenly tome monolith, accompanied by starlight. That was why he had Zhixiu tell Qin Changsheng that he did not need to wait for him to eat. Just like him, Zhong Hui, Zhuang Huanyu, Qi Jian, and the others had all forgotten how to write the 2 words "return" in front of the second monolith hut. But in this world, there would always be people who stood out from the masses, people with extraordinary talent and astonishing willpower. They would not be confused by any external object. Accompanied by the sunset, Go Hanshi returned to the grass hut. Smelling the fragrance of the egg custard wafting out from the kitchen, he looked at Qin Changsheng, who was sitting on the doorstep, staring blankly at the sunset. He asked, "Just what are you waiting for?" "There's one more chapter." Chapter 225. Qin Changsheng rubbed his eyes, which had been burned by the sunset, and stood up from the doorsill. He said, "I'm not waiting for anything." Go Hanshi said, "Although you want to walk a path that no one has walked before, and in your own words, that method is a bit stupid, you also said that it should be possible. Then logically, it's impossible for you to still be unable to understand the first heavenly tone monolith, because I know that your ability to comprehend is stronger than many people imagine." As the only two people in the world who dared to claim to be well-versed in the Taoist canon, he and Qin Changsheng were naturally rivals. From the Ivy League gathering to the grand examination, they competed against each other, but it was precisely because they were rivals that they truly understood each other. He saw Qin Changsheng go from a normal youth who did not know how to cultivate to ethereal opening in the rain in the education palace in only a few months. Without an extremely strong ability to comprehend, how could he have done this? Qin Changsheng thought about it and said, "I feel that the method I discussed with you last night is wrong." Go Hanshi slightly raised his eyebrows and asked, "What's wrong?" Qin Changsheng said, "I can't say what's wrong. If I follow the train of thought of comprehending the monolith inscriptions, I should be able to comprehend the heavenly tone monoliths. But I keep feeling that it's a bit strange. I keep feeling that something is missing. If I continue to comprehend it before I've completely thought it through, it'll be very hard for me to convince myself, because what I cultivate is to follow my heart." Go Hanshi said, "Could it be that you want to think of another method to comprehend the monoliths?" Qin Changsheng said, "I have this thought, but I haven't made up my mind yet." Go Hanshi frowned, thinking that changing one's path halfway was a great taboo for comprehending the monoliths. He said, "You know that this is a very dangerous thought." Qin Changsheng understood his meaning. If he continued to hesitate, the hope of comprehending the heavenly tone monoliths would become smaller and smaller. He seriously thought about it for a long time, then said, "If I really can't comprehend it, then forget it. No matter what you think, you can't be too pedantic." After saying this, Go Hanshi walked towards the house. Qin Changsheng looked at his back and said, "The egg soup is still a bit lacking. Don't be in a hurry to remove the lid." His words did not have any other meaning, but Go Hanshi understood it. He thought that perhaps his current waiting was reasonable. After a while, Zhishio returned to the grass hut. Out of the 7 people living in the grass hut, only he and Qin Changsheng had yet to successfully comprehend the monolith. Looking at the courtyard that was much colder compared to last night, his face showed hints of disgust towards himself. He asked Qin Changsheng, "Why can't I? Is there something wrong with my talent?" Qin Changsheng thought to himself, a wolf tribe youngster that didn't belong to any sect and was completely self-trained was able to make many demons tremble in fear in the cruel snowy plains and was able to steadily defeat Guan Fei Bai and other young experts on the honor roll of Azure Clouds. Not only was there no problem with his bloodline talent, on the contrary, it was ridiculously strong. It has nothing to do with talent. What does that have to do with anything? Diligence or focus? It has nothing to do with those. It's just because. Qin Changsheng looked at him and said seriously, "You don't study enough." Zhishio was a little angry. He had been wandering the snowy plains since he was a child. How could he have had the chance to study? Qin Changsheng took out the notebook left behind by Sun Mei and gave it to him. "It's fine if you don't study enough, but the most troublesome thing is that I've observed you and found out that you really don't like to study. You've only read the notebook left behind by seniors twice. Last night, you even fell asleep while reading it. How can this be?" Zheshio's face became pale, not because of injury, but because of anger. He took the notebook and went straight into the grass hut. At 5 in the morning of the next day, Qin Changsheng opened his eyes and used 5 breaths of time to calm his mind. Then he got out of bed and found Tang 36 sprawled on the side, snoring like thunder. Walking out of the hut, he saw that Qi Jian and the others were also sound asleep. Only then did he know that they had returned from the mausoleum of books at some unknown time last night. After washing his face and rinsing his mouth, he began to boil water and cook like he did 2 days ago. Then he began to sweep the courtyard and repair the broken fences. Even after Tang 36 and the others had finished their breakfast and went to the mausoleum of books to view the monoliths, he still did not have any intention of leaving. His face showed no signs of anxiety, and it even seemed like he was enjoying his current life. With everyone gone and the courtyard empty, he sat back on the doorstep, opened Sun Mei's notebook, and began to read it again. Gradually he became engrossed, and his gains increased. For the entire day, aside from cooking and cleaning, he did not leave the doorstep. Naturally, he did not even take a glance at the reflecting monolith. In the evening, Tang 36 and the others returned to the grass hut one after another. After eating, they sat around the table and began to discuss the inscriptions on the second monolith. The atmosphere was very lively. Chun Changshen called Jishio into the hut, took out the copper needles from the needle box, and began to treat him. Right now, he was only at the initial stage of determining the abnormality of the meridians. If he wanted to solve the problem that had tortured Jishio for over 10 years, it was not something that could be done in a short period of time. After a long time, they realized that 2 people were missing from the table. Qi Jian looked at the tightly shut door, and his young face revealed an expression of reluctance. Go Han sure wrinkled his brow and shook his head. Even he was beginning to feel that it was strange. Not wanting to agitate the 2 people in the hut, the discussion around the table stopped. Tang 36 suddenly stood up, pushed open the door, and looked at Chun Changsheng. Today, another 3 people passed. Chun Changsheng concentrated on twisting the copper needles between his fingers and said something to Jishio in a low voice, ignoring him. Time passed day by day, and it was already the 7th day since the examinees had entered the mausoleum of books. On the 5th day, Jishio finally passed the reflecting monolith. It was unknown whether it was because he had been reading for the past few nights. However, Chun Changsheng still had not succeeded in comprehending the monolith. At this point, he had set a new record. In the past, he had set an incomparably glorious record in the cultivation world, and that was being one of the youngest ethereal opening practitioners. This current record, however, was not so glorious. In all the previous grand examinations, first upon the first banner, he had taken the longest time to comprehend the first heavenly tome monolith, and it was even possible that he had taken even longer. In the blink of an eye, it had been the 10th day since they had entered the mausoleum. After 5:00 in the morning, Chun Changsheng finally left the grass hut and arrived before the monolith hut. He looked at the black monolith in silence, and no one knew what he was thinking. The morning light gradually brightened, and the monolith viewers entered the mausoleum of books, one after another. Arriving before the monolith hut, they saw him sitting cross-legged under the tree. At first, they were somewhat shocked, and then they felt even more emotions. In those people's eyes, one could see sympathy, pity, ridicule, and even schadenfreude. Some people avoided him from afar and walked into the monolith hut. Some people purposely brushed past him, and their footsteps seemed especially relaxed. Then, accompanied by the wind that lingered around the hut's eaves, they disappeared before the monolith. After the people in the grass hut finished their breakfast, they also came. Seeing this scene, Guan Fei wrinkled his brow, and without saying anything, he held the monolith and left. Tang 36 stood in front of him and asked, "Do you want me to accompany you?" Chun Changsheng raised his head, looked at him, and said seriously, "In the heavenly tome monoliths, even the shortest amount of time is extremely precious. You have to treasure it." Tang 36 was speechless. He thought to himself, "You've been a tourist and cook in the mausoleum of books for 10 days, and you still have the nerve to say such things." Jishio said nothing, and directly sat down next to Chun Changsheng. Chun Changsheng also said nothing. The morning wind lightly brushed the treetops, and the green leaves fell on the eaves. "Thank you, it's almost time," Chun Chong Sheng sincerely said. Jishyo stood up and walked into the monolith hut. This almost time was not to say that he saw the hope of comprehending the monoliths, but to say that Jishyo was accompanying him. On the afternoon of the 12th day, the spring sun was somewhat scorching. Chun Chongqing sat in the monolith hut, using the eaves to block out the sun. With a slight breeze, two young people appeared in front of the monolith hut. One of them was called Guian, a brilliant disciple of Gentle Stream Temple under the jurisdiction of Holy Maiden Peak in the south. He had placed third in the grand examination 2 years ago. The other was called Mu Nu, the strongest student of the Heavenly Tao Academy before Zhuang Huanyu. He had already been comprehending the monoliths in the Mausoleum of Books for more than 4 years. These two people were once geniuses on the proclamation of Azure Sky. As time passed, they comprehended the monoliths for a long time and broke through to ethereal opening. Now, they had already entered the proclamation of golden distinction. The northern and southern sects had always been at odds with each other. Outside the Mausoleum of Books, these two people were already famous. At the beginning, they were like fire and water, but now their relationship had become rather good. "You are Chun Chong Sheng." Mu Nu looked at him expressionlessly and asked. 10 days ago, when Zhong Hui succeeded in comprehending the monoliths, the two of them were present, but Chun Chong Sheng did not recognize them. He only knew that they should be previous monolith viewers. "I am. What advice do you two have?" The corner of Mu Nu's lips twitched, and he gave a faint smile, but he did not reply. Guan looked at Chun Chong Sheng, shook his head and sighed. The sect sent a letter saying that this year's grand examination produced an extraordinary person. Now it seems that it was really an exaggeration. Mu Nu said, "Otherwise, to be able to enter ethereal opening at the age of 15 is indeed extraordinary. It's just that at the beginning, cultivation is like a sharp blade cutting through bamboo, and afterwards it is stagnant like sand and difficult to advance. There are too many people like this in history. It must be understood that the Mausoleum of Books is the true test. This person could not even pass the reflecting monolith. I'm afraid he is also like this. It is truly a pity." They were clearly looking at Chun Chong Sheng, but they were talking to themselves as if Chun Chong Sheng did not exist, or perhaps they did not care about Chun Chong Sheng's reaction. Chun Chong Sheng was silent for a moment. Then he once again sat in front of the monolith. Guan and Mu Nu laughed, turned around, and walked down the Mausoleum of Books shoulder to shoulder. But their conversation continued. "What kind of person is Suyu Rong? How could she marry him? This is the hope of Orthodox Academy's revival? Truly laughable." Whether it was intentional or not, their voices were very clear and constantly transmitted into Chun Chong Sheng's ears. Afterwards, a burst of laughter came from the mountain path. Chun Chong Sheng quietly looked at the monolith, as if he was not affected in the slightest. Spring gradually deepened. In the sky, several hundred snow geese were returning from a distant place. They had come from the warm Great Western region and had crossed the sea to return to Heaven Pillar Peak, where they would spend the long summer. The geese cried, somewhat tired but still clear and bright. In the forest surrounding the monolith hut, the cries of birds rose up, as if mocking those snow geese for asking for trouble and for being unbearably stupid. Chun Chong Sheng raised his head to look at those two beautiful white lines in the blue sky. He recalled the time when he rode a crane on the mountain behind Xining Village and chased after a flock of snow geese. He began to laugh. "I feel that this chapter was written very well. Of course, tomorrow will be even better. I haven't asked for a monthly vote in quite a few months. Today is the first day of the 11th month, so I very sincerely summon everyone here. I'd like to trouble everyone to give their guaranteed monthly votes to Heaven's Seizing Notebook. The reason I dare to ask for monthly votes is because this month I won't be going out for anything. I'm getting restless. I really can't guarantee how many chapters I'll update every day, but I can guarantee that this month's chapters will definitely surpass 150,000 characters. Finally, please allow me to enthusiastically recommend to everyone my good friend and old friend, Katsuji Dashi's new book from the world of creation, Defeating the Invincible. The book number is 433109, and the link is below. Chuangshi, QQ/BK/XH/4333109. HTML. Chapter 226. Suddenly, the chirping of the birds in the forest disappeared without a trace. Perhaps it was because they knew that someone even noisier than them had arrived. Seeing Tang 36 appear in front of the monolith hut, Qin Changxing felt that it was rather strange. According to the routine of the past few days, this guy should not have been willing to leave the heavenly tone monoliths until it was late in the evening. Do you know who those two people are? Tang 36 looked in the direction of the mountain path and raised his eyebrows slightly. I don't know where they came from, too. Qin Changxing thought about his words and said, people who don't know what they are. Tang 36 saw the expression on his face and realized that he really didn't care about the ridicule from the two people. He said angrily, even if they are ignorant people, do you think they don't care? Qin Changxing said, don't talk about this. Why did you come out? Tang 36 finally remembered what he came here for. He stared into his eyes and said proudly, I saw the third monument. Qin Changxing was stunned and said, didn't that happen the day before yesterday? Tang 36 was obviously not satisfied with his reaction. He raised his voice and said, the important thing is, I am about to break through the state. Qin Changxing was startled for a second. Then a happy smile appeared on his face. He said sincerely, really? That's great. Tang 36 said helplessly, I'm about to surpass you. Do you understand? I've been waiting for this day. Qin Changxing's face was filled with joy. He took out a medicine box from his bosom and handed it over to him, saying, inside are instructions on how to take the medicine. Breaking through to the ethereal opening realm is a major event. You can't be careless. Which medicine to take at each step, the dosage to take each time. You must not make any mistakes. Tonight, I will ask Jishio to help keep an eye on it. Inside the box were the pills that Luo asked the priests of the Li Palace to make before the great examination. The pills used were the precious herbs that he and Tang 36 stole from the 100 Herb Garden and the rare herbs that Luo asked her clansmen to prepare. These pills were specifically used to help meditation realm Xiuzhe break through to the ethereal opening realm. In terms of medicinal strength, they wouldn't lose to Scholatry Manor's rising heaven pill. Tang 36 was speechless as he held the medicine box. He had wanted to motivate this guy, but how did the conversation end up like this? Suddenly, he thought, with Qin Changxing's behavior, could it be that he had truly given up on comprehending the monoliths? Thinking of this, his mood instantly became heavy. The atmosphere of spring became increasingly clear, and the flocks of snow geese returning to the capital from the great western continent increased. 20 days had already passed since the 3 grades of this year's grand examination had entered the mausoleum of books. In this period of time, people had successively solved the reflecting monolith. Only Qin Changxing continued to sit in front of the monolith hut every day. Compared to its initial liveliness, the current monolith hut seemed very deserted. Go Hanshi believed that there really was something wrong with his state of mind. Even Tang 36 and Jeshio had begun to lose confidence in him, and the monolith guardians who had always been secretly watching him had already lost interest in him, let alone the other monolith viewers. When they looked at his figure outside the monolith hut, they could not conceal the ridicule on their faces. The situation in the mausoleum of books was accurately transmitted to the capital. The fact that Qin Changxing still had not succeeded in comprehending the monoliths brought about many different reactions. In the divine general of the East's estate, Madame Su threw a rare temper at Su Shiji. She said that the family banquet should have been delayed for a few more days. Su Shiji remained silent and smashed a precious Rue Kiln porcelain cup. The atmosphere in the Bureau of Ecclesiastic Education became somewhat oppressive. Every day, Mei Shah would close his eyes and lie down in a room filled with plum blossoms, as if he was sleeping. However, Priest Exan had already clearly heard the old man mutter to himself several times with slight regret, "Did we push him too hard?" When Lady Mou was free, she would go to the small building in the Orthodox Academy and lie down on Chen Chongqing's bed for a while. However, as the scent of the clean youth on the pillow and bedding grew fainter and fainter, her mood also grew more and more irritable. When she was helping the Empress read the memorials, she really did harshly reprimand the two prefects. Tian Haishang Shui's return to Snowhold Pass did not affect the mood of the continent's current number one clan. Several manors in the capital continuously held banquets. Scholars and literati walked through them like dogs. The head of the family and several important figures of the Tianhai clan seemed calm, but in reality they were much more relaxed. Chen Chongqing's inability to comprehend the monoliths caused countless discussions in the capital. People tried to explain the situation, but they felt that it didn't make sense. The head of the Tianhai clan said something in a slightly mocking manner at one of the banquets. In the end, it became the consensus of the majority of people. No matter how bright a diamond is after such a fierce combustion, other than a few wisps of smoke, what else can be left? You have to know that last year he burned for an entire year. From the Ivy League gathering to the grand examination, the youth from Xining village had given the continent too many shocks and even miracles. The mausoleum of books had now become a mountain that lay in front of him. No one thought that the youth could continue to create miracles. Everyone thought that he would be like those geniuses that had fallen in history, quietly disappearing. Only one person still had confidence in Chen Chongqing. On the top floor of the Education Palace's great hall, Luo Luo stood by the railing, her hand resting on a sunshade. She did not like the false sunlight of this world. Looking into the distance, she could only see the unchanging perfection. She could not see the mausoleum of heavenly harvest in the real world, nor could she see the teacher currently viewing the monoliths within the mausoleum. Teacher has never cared about other people's hopes for him. He only lives for himself. But if you have hopes for him, then when has he ever disappointed you? She turned around and looked at Jean Yulu. Her beautiful little face was filled with trust and pride. I don't know why he still hasn't been able to comprehend the first heavenly tone monolith, but I'm very sure that it's not because he can't comprehend the first monolith, but because of some other reason. If he can succeed, then he will definitely make everyone speechless with shock. As usual, he woke up at 5 in the morning. He quietly opened his eyes, got out of bed, washed his face, and rinsed his mouth. He cooked and swept, then went to the mausoleum of books. The season of the year was in spring, and the season of the day was in the morning. The spring morning was the most beautiful time, only it was slightly cold. Chen Chongqing tightened his collar and sat down outside the monolith hut. He had already sat here for many days. Aside from occasionally going under the eaves to take shelter from the rain or the scorching sun, he had never moved. There was not a speck of dust on the limestone beneath him, and it had even become somewhat smooth. He had read the notebook left behind by Sun Mei many times, and had long since memorized it by heart. The monolith inscriptions on the heavenly tone monoliths, those complicated lines, had long since been deeply engraved in his sea of consciousness. Although he did not have enough time to completely understand the changes of the monolith inscriptions during the 4 seasons, he had already grasped the daily changes. As a result, he did not need to look at anything else, and directly closed his eyes. There was the sound of footsteps hurriedly passing by in the distance. There was also the sound of footsteps slowly passing by in front of him. There was the sound of suppressed voices discussing on the mountain path, and deliberately loud mocking words resounded in his ears. Afterwards, those voices slowly disappeared, leaving behind only silence and the chirping of the birds in the forest. The chirping of the birds in the forest suddenly became more concentrated, and then from high up in the sky came the cries of geese, one of which was especially clear. Qin Changxing opened his eyes and gazed up at the azure sky. From the east, he saw a flock of snow geese. He did not know how many batches of snow geese had returned to the capital. There was so much snow in the spring sky, and it was truly very beautiful. He thought to himself, that clear cry of a goose must have come from a young goose, or perhaps it was its first time on such a long journey. The snow geese continued to fly into the distance. They might stay in the capital for a few days and then continue west. That's all I can do. Chun Chongqing stood up and said this somewhat regretfully, and then walked into the monolith hut. Looking at the ice-cold monolith and those lines that he had already grown tired of, he shook his head. He thought to himself that his aptitude was indeed still not enough. Sun Mei's notebook had brought great benefits to him, as well as the other youths in the grass hut, in their comprehension of the monoliths. For example, Guan Fei Bai and the others to be able to comprehend the monoliths so smoothly was because they had approached the wisdom of their predecessors from the notebook and thus obtained some sort of inspiration. The benefit that Chun Changsheng had gained was that he now had many more things to refer to. In the notebook, Sun Mei had left behind many different ways of comprehending the monoliths. Just the reflecting monolith alone had over 10 different ways. However, the first sentence in Wang Zhi's notebook that he had found in the pavilion of ascending mist said that positions were relative, so what Qin Changsheng wanted to do was not to comprehend the monoliths according to those ways of thinking, but rather to avoid those ways of thinking and open up a completely new path. Through observing the natural changes of the monolith inscriptions between heaven and earth, he would be able to find an answer that completely belonged to him. He wanted to comprehend the monoliths in this way. This way of thinking was extremely likely to be correct, but to his requirements, it was still rather incomplete or perhaps not pure enough. It was still a variation of the 3 most mainstream and most orthodox methods of comprehending the monoliths. Or perhaps it could be said that this method of comprehending the monoliths was still not completely free from the influence of these fixed ways of thinking. He was somewhat dissatisfied with this, so he bitterly pondered for over 20 days. Regretfully, he still did not succeed. More importantly, just as he had said to Go Hanshi before, he cultivated in following his heart. He always felt that this method of comprehending the monoliths, and even the methods used by countless experts and saints in the past, were all wrong. He always felt that this mausoleum of books and these monoliths should have a deeper meaning, and that was what he truly wanted to see. It was truly regretful that he did not have any more time. That clear and bright cry of a goose woke him up. Time passed really quickly. In the blink of an eye, there were only a few days left until the opening of the Garden of Zhou. On the first day he entered the Mausoleum of Books, Go Hanshi had asked him if he wanted to go to the Garden of Zhou, or if he wanted to stay in the Mausoleum of Books a little longer. He had said that he would think about it when the time came. In the past few days, he had already thought about what he would choose. If he could not defy the heavens and change his fate or cultivate to the concealed divinity realm, then he only had 5 years left to live. Of course, he had to go to more places, see more scenery, and get to know more people. He wanted to go to the Garden of Zhou. Then he had to start comprehending the monoliths. Thus, he began to comprehend the monoliths. He raised his right hand, pointed at a certain place on the monolith, and said, "This is the character for home." At this moment, the sky was clear and bright. Among the incomparably complex lines on the monolith, there were a few lines that were slightly shallower. Under the light, they seemed to float and faintly seemed to be words. Then he pointed at another part of the monolith and said, "This is the character for river." Immediately after, without any pause, he looked at the area on the top of the monolith that absolutely no one would be able to see the words on, and said, "Light, smoke, illumination, eaves, autumn, clump." In the blink of an eye, he said 28 words without any pause. These were all words on the monolith. The last word was light. His voice was very clear, just like the cry of the goose from before, towards the unknown world. There was no fear, only expectation and only confidence. Then a cool breeze arose. He disappeared from in front of the monolith. Cool, there will be a next chapter, but it will definitely be very late. Friends who sleep early need not wait. Chapter 227. The 28 words that Qin Changxing saw on the stone monolith, when put together, formed a poem. A misty river illuminates the clear mist. The houses on both sides meet the painted eaves. The pale lotus leaves a section of autumn light. The fragrant wind curtains 10. This poem was written 2,000 years ago by the Master of the Way when he entered the mausoleum of books to view the monoliths. The first heavenly tome monolith in the mausoleum of books was named Reflecting Clear, and it came from this. The method that Qin Changxing used to comprehend the monoliths was to take fragments of the monolith inscriptions and form their own meanings. This method of comprehending the monoliths was actually very simple, very primitive. Countless years ago, when the heavenly tomes fell onto the continent, the still ignorant ancestors finally overcame their fear and cautiously arrived in front of the monolith. The first ancestor to understand the monolith also used a similar method, but what he saw was a simple picture. That picture could be a cow, a sheep, or even a dragon. Afterwards, someone saw an even more complicated picture on the heavenly tome monolith, with numbers and even more information and thus words. This method was also the cleanest because it did not have any unnecessary thoughts attached to it. At the very beginning, the ancestors definitely did not think that these strange stones hid some riddle that needed to be solved, nor did they think that there was any true essence flowing within those lines. It was just like what he and Gohanshi had discussed before. 2,000 years ago, the Master of the Way saw a poem on this heavenly tome monolith. He thought that this poem was a question. In the countless years that followed, countless cultivators tried to find the true answer from that poem, but they all came up empty-handed. Today, Qin Changxing also saw this poem, but this did not mean that he and that peerless expert from 2,000 years ago used the exact same method of comprehending the monoliths. Because he did not think that the poem was a question, he thought that it was what the heavenly tome monolith wanted to say. The heavenly light was different, and the lines were sometimes visible and sometimes hidden. The incomparably complicated lines could reveal countless words. These words could be combined into countless possibilities. They could be a poem, or they could be a great prose. The monolith did not speak. It was a text of its own. He had sat in front of this monolith for more than 20 days, and he did not know how many words he had seen. At any time, he could find countless poems that already existed in the world from those lines. But he clearly understood that those poems had always been in the heavenly tome monolith inscriptions. The monolith viewer only needed to find, see, and understand. There was no need for any other unnecessary thoughts. There were tens of thousands of ways to comprehend tablets in the world. Regardless of the meaning, shape, or momentum, they were all deciphering, learning, and imitating the information contained in the tablet inscriptions. But the heavenly tome monoliths never waited for anyone to decipher, study, or imitate them. The heavenly tome monoliths had always been waiting for someone to understand them. Qin Changxing had attempted to prove this point, and in the end, the mausoleum of books proved that his understanding was correct. Thus, he comprehended his first heavenly tome monolith, and then he saw the second heavenly tome monolith. In the depths of the lush forest, there was a stele in the hut. Next to the stele, there was a poem written by a great scholar. The poem was called the Piercing Cloudstone. The second heavenly tome monolith was the Cloud-Piercing Monolith. There were over 20 people sitting around the monolith hut. They stared at the somewhat flat and wide stone monolith beneath the hut. Some of them furrowed their brows in deep thought, while others muttered to themselves. Chun Chang Sheng walked to the front of the hut and saw some familiar faces in the crowd. The junior sister from Holy Maiden Peak, called Yi Xiaolian, heard the footsteps and raised her head. When she saw that it was him, she couldn't help but be startled. Some people also noticed Qin Changxing's arrival and were just as startled as her. In the past few days, the monolith viewers of the Mausoleum of Books had long become accustomed to seeing Qin Changxing's figure outside the reflecting monolith hut. Today, when they suddenly saw him appear in front of the piercing cloud monolith, they were momentarily stunned. In the next moment, the crowd understood that Qin Changxing had finally comprehended the first heavenly tome monolith. The crowd outside the monolith hut began to grow restless, and then they began to discuss with ridicule. You only managed to comprehend the first monolith now. What's there to be proud of? Correct. I always thought that my aptitude for comprehending scriptures was not good, but now it seems that I'm at least a little better than a certain someone. Qin Changxing was not proud. It was just that his appearance brought an indescribable pressure to the people outside the monolith hut. It was like a student who had always had excellent grades, but had suddenly fallen to the last place in a certain subject. Those students in the latter half of the class had been gloating over his misfortune for several days, but suddenly realized that the student was slowly catching up. How could they not be nervous, especially when they thought of the ridicule they had given him a few days ago? Some people could not help but feel somewhat flustered. In order to dispel this pressure, to wipe away the flustered emotions, then, as a matter of course, even more excessive ridicule appeared. Qin Changxing did not pay attention to these discussions and continued to walk forward. He entered the monolith hut, arrived in front of the cloud-piercing monolith, and raised his right hand. Outside the monolith hut came a cry of surprise. The news that Qin Changxing had comprehended the reflecting monolith was like the wind, spreading out of the Mausoleum of Books with extreme speed. It spread to the various manors in the capital, and it also spread to the Imperial Palace and the Li Palace. Upon hearing this news, some people finally let out a sigh of relief, such as Archbishop Mei Lisha. Prince Chen Lu's cheerful laughter resounded in the prince's estate. Mo Yu was currently dipping her brush in cinnabar. Hearing her subordinate's report, she was slightly startled, and then said with slight ridicule, "To only comprehend the first monolith at this time, what future does he have?" Several students of the Heavenly Academy were having a banquet in a restaurant. As they drank to their heart's content, it was inevitable that they would talk about comprehending the monoliths of the Mausoleum of Books. Just as they were ridiculing Qin Changxing and the Orthodox Academy, they received this news. The banquet instantly became quiet, and after a moment, a student said with ridicule, "With this speed, whether Qin Changxing can comprehend the second monolith this year is still a problem. Senior Zhuang already reached the third monolith the day before yesterday. How can they be compared?" Another student sighed, "It's still Gohanshi that's scary. He can probably be ranked in the top 3 of the last 10 years, right?" Upon hearing Gohanshi's name, the previous student was silent for a moment, and then said, "If he can maintain his current speed of comprehending the monoliths, I'm afraid he can be ranked in the ranking of the past 100 years." At this moment, a fellow student of the Heavenly Academy hurriedly ran up the stairs. His entire face was covered in sweat, and he could not hide his frightened expression. With a trembling voice, he said, "Qin Changxing just comprehended the second monolith." Upon hearing this, the several students of the Heavenly Academy were greatly shocked. They hurriedly stood up and actually knocked over a few plates of food and wine on the table. They looked at the fellow student and asked in disbelief, "What? How is this possible? Didn't he just comprehend the first monolith? How could he immediately comprehend the second?" No one answered their questions. The restaurant immediately became deathly silent. The mausoleum of books had 17 monoliths, and the third monolith was called Broken Osmanthus. Compared to the cloud-piercing monolith, there were a lot less people around the monolith hut, other than a few previous years' monolith viewers. Only the senior from Holy Maiden Peak, one person from Star Caesar Academy, Zhonghui, Zhuang Huanyu, and the 4 people in the grass hut had participated in this year's grand examination. It must be known that the heavenly tome monoliths became more and more difficult to comprehend. They had only entered the mausoleum for around 20 days and had already arrived in front of the third monolith. This could already be said to be very impressive. Seeing Chen Chongqing appear, everyone was very shocked. This was because in the morning they clearly saw him outside the first monolith hut. Didn't this mean that he only used half a day's time to consecutively comprehend 2 monoliths? Tang 36 immediately bounced up from the ground, walked up to him, and said with his eyes wide open, "I say, what are you doing?" Although his expression was somewhat evil, in reality, his eyes looking at Qin Chongqing were full of surprise. Qin Chongqing did not know how to explain. Zheshio's face was still a sheet of indifference, but his eyes faintly began to burn. He asked, "There has to be a reason." Qin Chongqing thought about it, then said, "The heavenly tome, first of all, should be a book." Hearing this, some people outside the monolith hut became pensive, while Zhuang Huanyu gave a cold snort. Qin Chongqing said to Tang 36, "I'll be leaving first." "You want to go back just like that?" "That's right, take a good rest." Tang 36 subconsciously said. In his view, Chen Chongqing had used half a day to comprehend 2 heavenly tome monoliths, so his mind must have been greatly exhausted. He really should return to the grass hut to rest. Qin Chongqing stared blankly, then pointed at the monolith hut and said, "I said to go there." Tang 36 was dumbfounded and stared blankly as he walked in front of the monolith and extended his hand. Seeing this scene, Zhuang Huanyu's complexion suddenly changed. Zhonghui, who had been sitting silently by the hut, became incomparably pale. The 4th heavenly tome monolith was called the River Guiding Monolith. This monolith just happened to be at the edge of a cliff, and the terrain was rather dangerous. There were quite a few people in front of this monolith hut. Last year, those who had entered the top 3 grades of the grand examination and entered the mausoleum of books to view the monoliths were basically all here. Qi Jian sat at the outermost edge of the monolith hut. His thin and weak body was blown by the wind at the edge of the cliff, giving off a feeling that he was on the verge of collapse. Qin Chongqing was somewhat surprised. This junior from the Mount Li Sword sect had actually comprehended the monoliths faster than Guanfei, Bai, and Liang Banhu. Of course, even more surprised were Qi Jian and the people present. Seeing him walk to Qi Jian's side and sit down, everyone's faces revealed an expression of shock. Compared to the first 3 heavenly tome monoliths, the inscriptions on the River Guiding Monolith were somewhat simpler. More accurately, it should be said that the lines on the monolith were still complex, but faintly there seemed to be some sort of pattern. Having a pattern was not necessarily a good thing for those viewing the monoliths, because their minds could easily be disturbed or even restricted. After Qin Chongqing and Qi Jian exchanged a few words, he turned his gaze to the monolith and began to earnestly observe it. Back then, how many days did it take for you and me to walk to the River Guiding Monolith? The voice of a sacred hall archbishop reverberated in the spacious main hall of the Li Palace. He looked at the several dozen statues of the virtuous predecessors, his expression somewhat perplexed, and his eyes still contained some shock. Similarly, one of the 6 prefects of the Orthodoxy, another Sacred Hall archbishop, did not answer this question. After a moment of silence, he said, "Although the front mausoleum monoliths are easy to comprehend, this is still a little too fast." Perhaps in the eyes of some people, Chen Chongqing had used around 20 days to reach the 4th heavenly tome monolith, but important figures of the orthodoxy like them naturally knew that it should not be calculated like this. From the moment he had begun comprehending the monoliths until now. Chen Changsheng had only used half a day, so it was half a day. Cultivating for a year to reach ethereal opening, viewing the monoliths for half a day to see the river guiding monolith, no wonder His Holiness values this child. Conversations like this were happening all over the capital, and only like this could they dispel the shock brought about by Chen Changsheng. When the news that Chen Changsheng did not directly comprehend the monoliths like before, but instead sat down in front of the river guiding monolith, many people simultaneously let out a sigh of relief. These people did not have any enmity towards Chen Changsheng, such as Prince Chenlu and Priest Xan. It was just that they felt that everything was too unreal. Now that Chen Changsheng had stopped advancing, it actually made them feel that everything that had happened today was real. Go Hanqi's performance in the Mausoleum of Books these past few days had already shaken the entire capital. Chen Changsheng's performance today was even more flabbergasting. If he still wanted to continue, who could stand up to him? However, as was often said, reality was often more inconceivable than one could imagine. Not too long after, everyone in the capital knew a piece of news. Chen Changsheng stood up from the cliff. Chen Changsheng walked into the monolith hut. Chen Changsheng had comprehended the river guiding monolith. Immediately after, Chen Changsheng comprehended the fifth heavenly tone monolith, the foul language monolith. Chen Changsheng arrived in front of the sixth heavenly tone monolith. This monolith was called the East Pavilion monolith, the first rank of the first banner in last year's grand examination. The Divine State's third law, Liang Xiaoxiao, had spent the past few months trying to comprehend this monolith. When he saw Chen Changsheng's figure, his cold and arrogant expression instantly disappeared without a trace, leaving only shock and intense confusion. Chen Changsheng nodded to him in greeting, but his feet did not stop. In front of the seventh heavenly tone monolith, there was only Go Hanqi. He was currently gazing at the distant mountains. Hearing footsteps, he turned his head and discovered that it was actually Chen Changsheng who had come. He could not help but slightly raise his eyebrows. Chen Changsheng walked to Go Hanqi's side. After a moment of silence, Go Hanqi said, "Extraordinary." Chen Changsheng did not know what to say, so he did not say it. Looking at him, Go Hanqi gradually became emotional. He said, "For the first time, I feel that you have a chance of becoming my senior's opponent." His senior was Qiu Shanjun. Even now, he still believed that Chen Changsheng had this possibility. Chen Changsheng was silent for a moment, then said, "There are still problems with the method of comprehending the monolith, but there's not enough time. I can only walk around and see." Go Hanqi sighed. Walk around and see? If other people heard these words, besides shame and anger, what other emotions would they have? Chen Changsheng glanced at the monolith and said, "I'm preparing to leave." Go Hanqi did not misunderstand like Tang 36. Looking at him, he said, "It seems that you have decided to go to the Garden of Zhou." Chen Changsheng thought it over, then said, "Let's walk around and see." It was still these 4 words. To many monolith viewers of the Mausoleum of Books, taking a step forward was as difficult as ascending to the heavens. But to him today, it seemed like he was just casually walking around. There were 2 people in front of the 8th heavenly tome monolith. He had seen these 2 people before. A few days ago, these 2 people had specially come to the reflecting monolith hut to see him and talk to him. That night, Tang 36 told him the names and backgrounds of these 2 people. Seeing Chen Changsheng, the 2 people looked like they had seen the Demon Lord, their faces filled with shock. Chen Changsheng walked into the monolith hut, then suddenly stopped. He turned around and asked them, "You too are Guen and Mu Nu?" That day in front of the monolith hut, they had asked him, "You are Chen Changsheng?" After all, Chen Changsheng was not a little girl selling buns, but a youth in the prime of his youth. How could he not have a temper? So before he left, he had also asked them a question. In the cool breeze that lingered around the monolith hut, Gui-en, and Mu-Nu's faces were incomparably red and hot. Arriving in front of the 11th heavenly tone monolith, it was finally quiet. Not far from the hut was a clear stream that gurgled delightfully. With Chen Chongqing's level of cultivation, he did not know that several mausoleum monolith guardians were currently watching him from a distance. Ji Jin's complexion was extremely unsightly. That night, in order to help Zhong Hui break through and comprehend the monoliths, he had consumed a great deal of energy that would be very difficult to recover from. Nian Guang watched Chen Chongqing walk towards the stream. He said nothing, his mood extremely complex. The orthodoxy had ordered him to look after Chen Chongqing in the mausoleum of books, but he had done nothing because, whether it was before or today, there was no need for him to do anything. Many years ago, he had been a student that the temple seminary had focused on nurturing, but he had been suppressed by those geniuses of the Orthodox Academy to the point where it was difficult for him to breathe. In the end, all his hopes turned to dust, and he decided to enter the mausoleum of books as a monolith guardian. Today, seeing Chen Chongqing comprehend 10 heavenly tone monoliths in a row, he very naturally thought of those old friends of the Orthodox Academy. Logically speaking, he should have been somewhat angry, but for some reason he actually felt somewhat gratified. Just like 10-odd years ago, when he learned that those geniuses of the Orthodox Academy who had suppressed him to the point where he could not breathe had all been killed, he did not feel happy, but rather somewhat sad. A monolith guardian said, "He's the fastest in the last 10 years, even faster than Wang Pa and Xiao Zhang." After a moment of silence, Nian Guang said, "Not just faster, but much faster. So fast that it can shock the world." Chen Chongqing walked to the stream bank and washed his face. Feeling somewhat refreshed, he continued to comprehend the monoliths. Seeing the cool breeze rise once more, the monolith guardians were silent. There were naturally many people in the mausoleum of books who had walked even further than Chen Chongqing. Let alone a monolith viewer like Sun Mei. It was rumored that there were cultivators in the 7th mausoleum who had viewed the monoliths for several hundred years. But Chen Chongqing had only used one day. Ji Jin thought back to all those years ago. When he arrived at the 11th monolith, he had used a whole 7 years. For a moment, he could not help but feel somewhat absent-minded. He began to have unprecedented doubts about his own life as a cultivator. His spiritual sense shook uneasily, and the injuries he had suffered from a few days ago secretly flared up. He leaned against an old tree beside him, swaying and on the verge of collapse. Nian Guang and the others did not notice his abnormality, because they were also still immersed in shock. If his surname was not Zhou, I really would have suspected that he was that person's descendant. The sunset filled the sky, and he finally felt a trace of exhaustion. He gazed into the distance and saw that the capital in the twilight was incomparably magnificent. He quietly stood there for a while, then turned around. Facing the setting sun, he walked into the monolith hut. The front mausoleum of books had a total of 17 monoliths, and this was the last one. In the past, there was Zhou Dufu, and now there was Chen Chongqing. In one day, he had seen all the monoliths of the front mausoleum. Please cast your monthly vote at the beginning of the month. Please cast your recommendation vote on Monday. Thank you, everyone. Please cast 2 more votes. Thank you very much. In addition, I've already told everyone in the first few chapters that comprehending the monolith will definitely not have any new ideas. Just designing the method is exhausting, so how can I care about new ideas? What we want is to feel refreshed. But nonsense. Do you really think that there is nothing new at all? Can I be guessed by you? You underestimate me too much. What did Tang Niu say again? Everyone watch carefully in the next 2 days. That is called a brand new future. Young man, please continue to create miracles. Be fast. After a moment of silence, Nian Guang said, "Not all of them have to be fast, but very fast, so fast that it will shock the world." Chen Chongqing walked to the stream bank and washed his face. He felt much more refreshed, and then continued to comprehend the monoliths. Seeing the cool breeze in the monolith hut rise again, the monolith guardians were silent. There were naturally many people in the mausoleum of books who had walked further than Qin Changsheng, let alone a monolith viewer like Sun Mei. It was rumored that there were cultivators in the 7th mausoleum who had viewed the monoliths for hundreds of years. But Qin Changsheng had only used one day. Jin thought back to all those years ago. When he reached the 11th monolith, he had used a whole 7 years. For a moment, he could not help but feel somewhat absent-minded. He had unprecedented doubts about his own life as a cultivator. His spiritual sense trembled uneasily, and the injuries from a few days ago secretly flared up. He leaned against an old tree next to him, swaying and about to fall. Nian Guang and the others did not notice his abnormality, because they were also still immersed in shock. If his surname was not Shou, I would really suspect that he was that person's descendant. The sunset filled the sky, and he finally felt a trace of exhaustion. He looked into the distance and saw that the capital in the twilight was incomparably magnificent. He stood there quietly for a while, then turned around. Facing the setting sun, he walked into the monolith hut. The front mausoleum of books had a total of 17 monoliths, and this was the last one. Before, there was Zhou Dufu, and now there was Qin Changsheng. In one day, he had seen all the monoliths of the front mausoleum. Please cast your monthly vote at the beginning of the month. Please cast your recommendation vote on Monday. Thank you, everyone. Please cast 2 more votes. Thank you very much. In addition, I already said to everyone in the first few chapters that comprehending the monoliths is definitely not something new. Just designing the method is already exhausting me to death. So how can I care about anything new? What I want is to feel refreshed, but nonsense. Do you really think that there is nothing new at all? Can I be guessed by you? You underestimate me too much. What did Tang Niu say? In the next 2 days, everyone watch carefully. That is called a brand new future. Young man, please continue to create miracles. Chapter 228. 14 years of not cultivating, only reading, 1 year of ethereal opening, 20 days of not comprehending the monoliths, only meditating, 1 day of comprehending the entire front mausoleum. After the Pope learned of what happened in the mausoleum today, he gave these 2 comments to Qin Changsheng. Following the deliberate spread of some important figures of the orthodoxy, these 2 comments were like the sunset, quickly spreading throughout the capital. The shocked people once again looked towards the mausoleum in the south, all sorts of emotions welling up in them. For countless years, only Zhou Dufu had managed to comprehend the entire front mausoleum in 1 day. Today, Qin Changsheng had also done it. Could he be the second Zhou Dufu? However, some people had already noticed a few inexplicable things. According to the news from the mausoleum, Qin Changsheng's cultivation did not change as he comprehended the monoliths. It was still at the initial stage of ethereal opening. It must be known that when Zhou Dufu strolled through the mausoleum, his eyes fell on the monolith inscriptions, his steps in the hut, his cultivation did not change at all. For example, among the people that entered the mausoleum at the beginning of this year, sculpture manners Zhong Hui had already broken through to ethereal opening. There were also many people like Tang 36 who already saw the possibility of breaking through. Logically, after Qin Changsheng comprehended all 17 monoliths, he should have comprehended something. Even if he did not break through on the spot, he should have improved. Priest Xian supported His Eminence, Archbishop Mei-Lisha, to the Li Palace. After paying his respects to the Pope, he mentioned the discussions going on in the capital. After a moment of hesitation, he said, "Many people are suspecting that Qin Changsheng used some sort of trick, or that our orthodoxy did something to the mausoleum of books. Comprehension is comprehension. Comprehending the monoliths is always a cultivator's own cultivation. No one can really change anything." The Pope took a wooden ladle and watered the green leaf potted plant. He said, "I don't think that child has the chance to catch up to Zhou Dufu. After all, it requires a great deal of courage, and is related to personality. His outstanding performance has already made me very satisfied. It can even be said to be very unexpected. Mei Li Sha said, "What I want to know the most is how he will react when he sees the last monolith. Will he be as surprised as we were today?" The Pope's wooden ladle stopped above the green leaf and tilted slightly, as if he was thinking of something. Miraculously, the water in the ladle did not drip. Officer Exen was startled at the sight and thought in confusion. The 17 monoliths of the Mausoleum of the Heavenly Books had already been solved by Qin Changsheng. How could there still be a final monolith? The Pope shook his head and continued watering. "Even if I could see it, could it be solved?" Mei Lisha faintly smiled and said, "That child has already brought so many surprises. Adding one more doesn't seem to be a difficult matter to understand." The dew platform burned like a huge torch in the darkest twilight. The Divine Empress held her hands behind her back and stood at the side of the platform. She looked in the direction of the Mausoleum of Books, and a hint of ridicule appeared on her cold face. They both used a single day to view all the monoliths of the front mausoleum, but Zhou Dufu truly understood them back then. Qin Changsheng was still far from it. Among the people who were still alive on the continent, she and His Holiness the Pope were an extremely small number of people who had come into contact with Zhou Dufu and could even be said to be familiar with him. Only they knew exactly how terrifyingly powerful that strongest expert of the continent was. So they did not believe that Qin Changsheng could be compared to that person. Mo Yu stood behind her and could not hold back for a moment. She said, "But to view 17 monoliths in a single day is already very impressive. At the very least, he's much stronger than I was in the past." The Divine Empress did not turn around. She looked at the Mausoleum of Books and thought of those cultivators who had viewed the monoliths in the Mausoleum of Books since ancient times. The ridicule on her face grew stronger and stronger. Just what is the purpose of viewing the monoliths? Why do some people never understand? Viewing the monoliths has never been the goal of cultivating the Tao, but a method of cultivating the Tao. When the Empress destroyed the proclamation, it was to teach the people of the world not to go astray. It's a pity that no one knows of the Empress' painstaking efforts. Mo Yu softly said, "Correct. If it is of no help to one's cultivation, even if one understood all the monoliths on the mausoleum, what use would it be? Back then, I had Zhou Tong destroy that monolith below the mausoleum. Quite a few elders in the orthodoxy wept bitterly and said that I did not follow the rules of the ancestors. Now that I think about it, I really should have killed off that group of old fools." The Divine Empress indifferently said, "Even if the heavenly tone monoliths are sacred objects, they still have to be used by people for them to have any meaning. Qin Changsheng's speed at comprehending the monoliths is truly much faster than yours. But back then, you succeeded in star condensation in the Mausoleum of Books. What about him? Even if he understood all the monoliths, it would not increase his cultivation at all. So what's the use?" The same meaning appeared twice in these two sentences. The first sentence was directed at all the cultivators of the world, while the second sentence was directed at Qin Changsheng. Mo Yu was slightly surprised at first, but then she began to laugh. She thought to herself, to think that even the Empress knows how to use vulgar language. It seems that Qin Changsheng's performance in the Mausoleum of Books still made the Empress somewhat vigilant. Of course, she was not vigilant against Qin Changsheng himself, but against the orthodoxy behind him. Mo Yu did not conceal her emotions. This was also the fundamental reason why she had always been able to obtain the Empress' love and trust. She opened her eyes wide and asked curiously, "Then in your opinion, does Qin Changsheng have a chance?" The Divine Empress looked in the direction of the Mausoleum of Books. After a moment of silence, she said, "He might be able to see the last monolith, but he's too calm and young. But he has an unpleasant smell of sourness and decay. He's not like Zhou Dufu in the past, who was as brilliant as the morning sun, his momentum like a hurricane, cursing the heavens and cursing the earth, wanting to get to the bottom of things. Mo Yu slightly frowned. She felt that every time the Empress mentioned that peerless expert, her emotions seemed to fluctuate somewhat. Cultivating the Tao is cultivating the heart. Character determines fate, and it also determines how far a cultivator can walk. The Divine Empress made her final judgment. Qin Changsheng is no good. After comprehending the 17th monolith, Qin Changsheng arrived at a verdant meadow. In the twilight, the entire mausoleum of books seemed to be ablaze, and this meadow was naturally no exception. An invisible wildfire spread and rolled on the grass, creating an extremely beautiful scene. The roar of water came from the cliff below the meadow. Only then did he realize that he had actually arrived at the top of the waterfall on the southwest side of the mausoleum of books. The wind from the cliff carried up the spray from the waterfall and landed on his face. It was slightly damp and cool, washing away his exhaustion. He thought about the process of comprehending the monoliths today. Although he was still somewhat unsatisfied, he could not help but feel somewhat happy. He felt that he was still all right. Suddenly he felt something. The joy on his face gradually faded, and he seemed somewhat perplexed. He turned his head and saw that under the white cliff above the meadow there was a monolith hut. The 17 heavenly tome monoliths of the front mausoleum had all been comprehended. According to the records in the Taoist canon, he should now be in the next mausoleum. But this was still the front mausoleum. The shape of that monolith hut was no different from the reflecting monolith hut and the river guiding monolith hut. Qin Changsheng was very shocked. Could it be that the front mausoleum still had a heavenly tome monolith? The front mausoleum of books had 17 monoliths. This was a fact that everyone knew, unless someone had concealed this fact. But who could conceal it? Qin Changsheng suddenly remembered that in the Taoist canon that he had read in Xining village, as well as the theories that had been passed down in the world, in the very beginning, the mausoleum of books did not have a front mausoleum and a back mausoleum. This theory should have appeared around 800 years ago. What did this mean? Standing in the burning meadow, he did not hesitate for too long. He began to walk towards the monolith hut, breaking through the weeds as he walked. It was like he was walking through fire, or like a fishing boat cutting through the surface of a river with 10,000 glints of light. Arriving in front of the monolith hut, he stopped and looked down. He saw a completely unexpected scene, and he could not help but stare blankly at it. This monolith hut did not have a heavenly tome monolith. To be more precise, this monolith hut once had a heavenly tome monolith, but now that heavenly tome monolith had already disappeared. All that remained was the monolith base. On the monolith base, there was a slightly protruding, broken stone, about half a palm wide. This broken stone was only a shallow section. Perhaps it was the remains of that heavenly tome monolith. Qin Changsheng's body became extremely stiff. His previous joy and relaxation had long been replaced by shock. The fact that the front mausoleum of the mausoleum of books actually had 18 heavenly tome monoliths was already enough to shock him. However, what was even more unexpected was that the final monolith was actually a broken monolith. He stood in a daze in front of the monolith hut for a long time before he finally calmed down. He suppressed the intense shock and unease in his heart and walked in front of the broken monolith. He discovered that only a very small portion of the monolith remained, and there were no words or lines on it. In other words, the monolith inscriptions should all be on the broken monolith. He reached out and touched the section of the broken monolith. He felt the hardness of the monolith and the stone stubble that was still sharp even after countless years of wind and rain. His expression became more and more perplexed. This stone tablet seemed to have been forcefully broken by a powerful force. In the first year of the primordial beginning, the heavenly tome monoliths fell to the ground. The base of the monoliths naturally took root, connecting to the deepest parts of the earth. In the 3,000 Taoist canons and the countless folk tales, he had never heard that the heavenly tome monoliths could be broken and taken away from the mausoleum of books. Where did this power come from to break this heavenly tome monolith? If it was a person, then who was that person? How did he do it? That heavenly tome monolith, where did he take it? Chen Changsheng gazed at the burning fields outside the hut, perplexed. Dusk gradually deepened. The night was approaching, and the mountain winds gradually grew cold. He felt somewhat cold. The joy and satisfaction from before had disappeared long ago. The shock from seeing the broken monolith had also disappeared without a trace. His mind had already become somewhat numb. His heart was filled with boundless reverence, even fear. Was this what true power was like? Night enveloped the mausoleum of books. As the last wisp of sunset disappeared from the horizon, the myriad of stars once again occupied the sky and people's fields of vision. Chen Changsheng stood outside the monolith hut, raising his head to look at the starry sky, motionless. He had maintained this posture for a very long time. After being accompanied by that shadow for so many years, he was after all no ordinary youth. Although he still could not talk cheerfully and wittily before death, after using it for so long, no matter how powerful the power, it was no longer able to affect his mind. He turned around and walked back into the monolith hut, standing in front of the broken monolith. The next chapter is before 10:30. Chapter 229. Standing in front of the broken monolith. Chen Changsheng didn't think about the broken monolith, nor did he try to find the story from many years ago. Instead, he was thinking about his own problem. He knew that not all monolith viewers could see the broken monolith in front of him. Then he really wanted to know what it meant for him to see this broken tablet, just as some people in the capital had already discovered, just as the Divine Empress had said to Mou on the sweet dew. There truly was something wrong with him reading all the monoliths of the front mausoleum in one day. He had seen and understood those monolith inscriptions, but he had not attempted to obtain any more information from them. As a result, he naturally did not comprehend any true meaning beyond the monolith inscriptions. He very easily understood the heavenly tome monoliths, but he did not seem to gain anything from them. But this was not a problem, at least not a problem he was thinking about and worrying about now. The reason why he did not use the three most common and orthodox methods of comprehending the monolith, apart from some deeper reasons, was that there was a problem with his meridians. True essence could not flow back and forth in his broken meridians, so no matter how abundant it was meaningless. Thus, he had to find a new method. It looked like he had obtained great success, becoming the second person after Zhou Dufu to see all the front mausoleum tablets in one day. However, he still felt that something was off. It was just like the regret and helplessness he felt before he decided to start comprehending the monolith. The method he used to comprehend the monoliths was very ingenious, but it was still a variation of this method. He had originally believed that after consecutively comprehending 17 heavenly tome monoliths, he would no longer care about this matter. However, now that he saw this broken monolith, he finally understood that what was incomplete was incomplete. You could deceive the heavens and the earth, deceive the sovereign and the saints, deceive your father and mother, deceive your master and friends, but you could not deceive yourself. The front mausoleum of the Mausoleum of Books originally had 18 monoliths, but now one was missing. Therefore, even though he had deciphered 17 of the tablets, there were still some incomplete ones. This feeling of being incomplete was very uncomfortable for him. It was just like the method he used to comprehend tablets. It was indeed very powerful, but it was ultimately a compromise. For the sake of going to the Garden of Zhou, he wanted to decipher these monoliths as quickly as possible. So he gave up on the 20-odd days of bitter searching. Seeing all the front mausoleum tablets in one day was indeed impressive. But to him, wasn't it also a form of failure? Because what he cultivated was to follow his heart. In the end, it was hard for his heart to be at peace. After standing in front of the broken monolith for a long time, Chen Changsheng still couldn't understand anything. Chen Changsheng walked down the mountain. The monolith huts along the way were very quiet in the night. There was not a single person. Accompanied by the starlight, it didn't take long for him to walk past 17 monolith huts and return to the reflecting monolith. The area outside the reflecting monolith hut was filled with people, a dense black mass. As it turned out, the monolith viewers who usually sat in front of the monolith hut had all come here tonight. They were waiting for Qin Changsheng. Seeing his figure appear outside the monolith hut, the crowd became restless. Tang 36 walked up to him, stared into his eyes, and asked, 17? Qin Changsheng nodded. Tang 36 laughed happily and patted his shoulder. He repeated to the crowd, 17. The sounds of discussion came to an abrupt end, and all around the monolith hut was quiet. People looked at Qin Changsheng and were shocked speechless. Yi Xiaolian widened her eyes and looked at Qin Changsheng, feeling a little strange. In this world, was there really someone that could compare to Senior Qiu? 17 heavenly tone monoliths. I'm afraid even Senior Qiu would find it very difficult to accomplish, right? She thought of the humiliation she had given Qin Changsheng that day by the divine avenue of the Li Palace. She couldn't help but feel ashamed and lower her head. Qin Changsheng said nothing and walked down the mountain with Tang 36. Countless gazes fell upon his body. Those gazes were filled with envy and even reverence. Anyone under such gazes would feel somewhat intoxicated. If he were to leave now, the gazes and starlight that fell upon his body would all be a form of glory. But in the next moment he stopped. Tang 36 glanced at him in astonishment. Qin Changsheng stood there for a while, then suddenly turned and walked towards the monolith hut. What's wrong? What did you leave inside? Tang 36 looked at him and asked in confusion. Qin Changsheng said nothing. He walked straight to the edge of the forest outside the monolith hut, lifted the front of his robe and sat down. Just like he had done for the past 20-some days, he once again began to view the monoliths. He still sat in the same place. The gray stone was very clean and had already become smooth. What are you doing? Tang 36 walked in front of him and asked in shock. Zhexiu, Go Hanqi, and the others also walked over. After a moment of silence, Qin Changsheng said, I feel that the method I used to comprehend the monoliths was wrong, so I plan to try again. These words caused an uproar around the monolith hut. Everyone was flabbergasted, shocked, confused, and at a loss. Just what did Qin Changsheng want to do? Su Mou asked why. Qin Changsheng did not answer. Guan Fei Bai's expression chilled as he asked, just why? He still did not answer. Go Hanqi did not ask, so he probably vaguely understood. Zhuang Huanyu mocked from afar, pretentious. Zhong Hui said nothing, but a young scholar from Scholarly Manor sneered, What are you pretending for? Even if you're amazing, is there a need for you to sit here and humiliate everyone? Qin Changsheng paid no attention to these discussions. He said to Tang 36 and the others, It seems like tonight's dinner will have to be prepared by you all. Just as the divine empress had said. Only Zhou Dufu truly understood the monoliths of the front mausoleum after seeing them all in one day. Besides talent and comprehension, the most important thing was one's personality. Zhou Dufu was arrogant and haughty. In order to get to the bottom of things, he was willing to tear open the heavens. How could Qin Changsheng have such boldness? Yet she did not know that although Qin Changsheng's personality was calm, he cared a great deal about following his heart. His desire to get to the bottom of things might have appeared very indifferent, but in reality it was equally intense, like a wildfire. When the news that he had once again sat down in front of the reflecting monolith reached the capital, everyone was dumbfounded. The divine empress did not speak for a very long time. Some people wanted to see just what mysteries Qin Changsheng was playing, but they were chased away by Nian Guang, not allowing them to disturb him. Tang 36 carried a lunchbox and delivered dinner to him. Qin Changsheng continued to view the monoliths. He watched as the starlight fell and the monoliths seemed to be covered in snow. He thought of a line in Sun Mei's notebook, and then he thought of something Gohanshi had said when he first entered the mausoleum of books. The heavenly tome monoliths were fragments of some world. Since these heavenly tome monoliths were once one, then was it wrong to individually comprehend each monolith? Should he not link these 17 monoliths together and comprehend them? He calmly gazed at the reflecting monolith under the hut, but it was as if he was simultaneously looking at the bent osmanthus monolith, the river-guiding monolith. 17 monoliths simultaneously appeared before his eyes. Don't worry, I'll have to comprehend the monoliths for a few more days. My Chongqing understood it instantly yesterday, and tomorrow it will explode. Today's chapter title is slightly awesome. Also, in yesterday's chapter, the sentence about the surname Zhou was wrong. Sometimes when you're too excited, it's easy for your hand to slip. Also, in yesterday's Xieqianji online game, a friend said that he couldn't log in. Right now it's closed beta, so there aren't many servers open. It will only be officially released on the 7th. Everyone, don't be angry, don't be anxious. Chapter 230. 1,000 years ago, there was no such thing as the 17 monoliths of the front mausoleum. Later on, they suddenly appeared, so they naturally had their own meaning. What Chun Chongsheng needed to do now was to find this meaning. Of course, he had also thought that it was extremely likely that this meaning would disappear with the disappearance of the heavenly tome monolith, never to be found again. However, if he clearly knew that his process of comprehending the heavenly tome monoliths was not complete, and yet he did not even attempt to find that missing part, then the gap in his mind would never be mended. This was something he could not accept. The reflecting monolith, the cloud-piercing monolith, the bent osmanthus monolith, the river-guiding monolith, the foul language monolith, the East Pavilion monolith, the 17 monoliths of the front mausoleum simultaneously appeared before his eyes. In the center of his vision was the reflecting monolith, while the other 16 heavenly tome monoliths were in the surroundings, constantly moving and attempting to combine. However, those monolith inscriptions were so profound and complex, and those lines were so complex and difficult to understand. There were no natural lines between the lines, and there were no traces that could be found between the marks. No matter how he tried to combine them, he could not find any evidence that these monolith inscriptions were originally one. He even had a feeling that even if that broken monolith was restored to its original state, and then he could see the monolith inscriptions on it, he still would not be able to put them all together. In the past several hundred years, no one had ever discovered the mysteries of the 17 monoliths of the front mausoleum. Perhaps this already meant that his attempts were futile. He quietly sat outside the monolith hut, and at some point he had already closed his eyes. The 17 monoliths were still rapidly moving and combining in his sea of consciousness without a moment's pause. This caused his spiritual sense to be consumed faster and faster, and his face to grow paler and paler. The world outside the mausoleum was also quiet. Most of the lights in the capital had already been extinguished. Only the mansions of the nobles and the two most important places, the Imperial Palace and the Li Palace, were still brightly lit. The news that Chun Chongqing was determined to comprehend the monoliths of the front mausoleum shocked many people, and they even mocked him. It also made it difficult for some people to sleep. Time slowly but steadily passed. The dazzling stars in the night sky gradually faded. After the darkness before dawn, the morning light once again shone upon the earth. Unknowingly, Chun Chongqing had already sat in front of the monolith hut for an entire night. Many people in and outside the mausoleum had also waited for him for an entire night. The morning sun shone brightly, and the monolith viewers gradually came up from the mountain path. Looking at Chun Chongsheng, who was sitting in front of the tree with his eyes closed and not saying a word, they all had different expressions. Some had admiration, some had ridicule, and some had an indescribable sense of relief. Last night's situation was unusual. Nian Guang could drive away all the monolith viewers, but he couldn't do it forever. Thus, the forest gradually became lively. Some people looked at Chen Changsheng, shook their heads, and returned to their own monoliths. There were some people who specifically stayed around the monolith hut, wanting to see what Chen Changsheng would be able to comprehend in the end. They thought in schadenfreude that Chen Changsheng had completely comprehended the front mausoleum yesterday. He could have easily left, but he still chose to stay behind. It was extremely likely that he would be shooting himself in the foot. Note, the people in the grass huts also came to the front of the monolith hut. Tang, 36, carried a pot of porridge. This young master of Wenshui, who had been born with a golden spoon in his mouth, had clearly never done any housework. The porridge spilled all over the place, and quite a bit of it even drenched his shoes. He looked rather miserable. Zhexiu carried the side dishes and steamed buns, while Qi Jian carried the bowl and chopsticks. Chen Changsheng opened his eyes, took the congee, thanked Qi Jian, and began to eat. After eating 2 bowls of porridge and a steamed bun with white fermented bean curd, he felt 70% full and put down his chopsticks. Tang, 36, looked at his slightly pale face and worriedly said, "If you don't eat more, how can you endure?" Chen Changsheng replied, "If you eat too much, it's easy to get sleepy." Tang, 36, furrowed his brows and said, "Although I don't know what you want to comprehend, since you insist, I know I can't persuade you otherwise. But do you really plan on not resting or sleeping?" Go Hanqi said nothing. He knew why Chen Changsheng was in such a hurry. It was because the day of the Garden of Zhou's opening was getting closer and closer. Zhixiu placed a wet towel in front of Chen Changsheng. The towel was wet from the stream water, so it was very cold. Chen Changsheng forcefully rubbed his face and felt that his spirit had recovered somewhat. He said to the crowd, "You don't need to worry about me." After saying this, he closed his eyes again. Although he closed his eyes, Go Hanqi and the others all knew that he was still viewing the monoliths. Perhaps it was not too harmful to the eyes, but this method of viewing monoliths was too harmful to the mind. The morning birds flew away towards the morning sun, drying off the moisture on their wings. The area in front of the monolith hut became quiet once more. It seemed that everyone had left. Chen Changsheng sat cross-legged in front of the hut with his eyes closed, continuing to comprehend the monoliths. Time continued to flow. Noiselessly, it was noon, and then it was evening. The twilight was very thick. Today, the capital was as quiet as the mausoleum of books. The archbishops of the Li Palace were not in the mood to pay attention to the reports of their subordinates. The ministers of the imperial court were not in the mood to deal with government affairs. The speed at which MOU read through memorials had greatly decreased. The divine empress was strolling through the palace of great clarity with a black goat, thinking about something. In a single day, the Pope had watered the green leaf 7 times. Those who did not know or did not understand only regarded Chen Changsheng's actions as sensationalism or some sort of topic of conversation. Those who knew of Zhou Dufu's comprehension of the monoliths and understood the inside story of the mausoleum of books were nervously waiting for something to happen. Or perhaps it would not happen. At least, up until now, that thing had not happened. The 17 heavenly tome monoliths, in Chen Changsheng's field of vision, or perhaps in his sea of consciousness, had recombined countless times. Although it could not be said that he had exhausted all the changes, he had already expended his greatest effort and expended countless amounts of mental energy. Regretfully, he still had not found what he wanted to find. To him, the world was still incomplete. Suddenly, a glimmer of light flashed through his mind. He no longer attempted to combine the 17 heavenly tome monoliths together. To be more precise, he no longer attempted to combine the 17 heavenly tome monoliths on the same plane. Instead, he arranged the 17 heavenly tome monoliths into a straight line in his sea of consciousness. In front of him was the reflecting monolith, behind the cloud-piercing monolith was the reflecting monolith, and behind them was the snapping monolith. They were arranged in a straight line. Then he said to himself, as long as the monolith inscriptions. As a result, the bodies of the 17 monoliths disappeared, leaving behind only those extremely complex lines on the surface of the monoliths. The 17 monolith inscriptions, from near to far, floated in front of him. His gaze passed through the monolith inscriptions of the reflecting monolith, and he could see the monolith inscriptions of the 16 monoliths behind it. These monolith inscriptions superimposed on each other, forming a brand new image that Qin Chongqing had never seen before or even imagined. As he looked at this image, his mind was slightly shaken. The 17 monoliths of the front mausoleum, the further one went, the simpler and more orderly they seemed. The superimposition of lines also meant the superimposition of laws, was the thing he was looking for hidden within. However, the lines on the reflecting monolith were already extremely complex and hard to decipher. The lines on the monoliths at the back were relatively simpler, but they were still complex and hard to decipher. Thus, when superimposed on each other to form the image, it was countless times more complex. Relying on a human's spiritual energy, it would forever be impossible to decipher it. So much so that if one tried to decipher it, problems would arise. Qin Chongqing glanced at it, and with a slight movement of his spiritual sense, he felt extremely uncomfortable. His sea of consciousness trembled uneasily, and a sharp pain came from his chest. He spat out a mouthful of blood, drenching his clothes. From beginning to end, the surroundings of the monolith hut, which seemed to be completely silent, suddenly erupted with cries of alarm. However, as if they were worried that they would affect Qin Chongqing, those people forcefully suppressed their cries of alarm to an extremely low level. Qin Chongqing's eyes were closed, so he could not see the situation outside the monolith hut. His mind was also completely focused on the incomparably complex image, so he did not notice any of this. With just a glance, he knew that this image could not be deciphered by a human. He silently said in his heart, simpler. These 3 words were not said to the image, but to himself. In a cultivator's sea of consciousness, however one viewed the world would become the way one wished to see it. He forcefully reined in his thoughts, relying on a mental state that far exceeded his age, as well as a spiritual sense that could even slightly move the divine empress. He once again gazed at the image. He no longer attempted to organize and calculate those lines. He simply looked at it, and as a result, the image also became somewhat simpler. Within the image, he saw countless simple images that resembled the graffiti of a child. He saw countless words, he saw countless poems, he saw countless ink paintings, he saw the beautiful and magnificent buildings of the Li Palace, he saw the great banyan tree of the Orthodox Academy, he saw the high mountains and flowing clouds, and he also saw the 3,000 scriptures of the Taoist canon. Everything that already existed in this world was in this image. But it was still not enough because there was still too much complexity. Qin Chongqing silently said to himself, simpler. He forgot the 3,000 scriptures of the Taoist canon that he could only memorize after studying hard since childhood. He forgot the poems he read. He forgot that he once went to the Li Palace. He forgot that he once climbed up that great banyan tree and stood side by side with Luo Luo. He forgot all the words he learned. He forgot everything. This type of forgetting was obviously not true forgetting. It was only a kind of self-isolation in the mental aspect. Only by doing this could he ask himself a question. If he was an illiterate child, what would he think of when he saw these lines on the image? They were traces. They were traces of water. They were traces of moving clouds. They were traces of flying geese that left on the blue sky. Every walk must leave a trace. No, that was the false and slightly sour self-consolation of the writer. The snow geese flew across the blue sky and didn't leave any traces. The so-called snow lines were actually only afterimages in the eyes. What exactly were these lines pointing at and explaining? The snow lines pointing at and explaining were the snow geese at the very front of the line. These lines pointing at and explaining were the ends of the lines. If there were no ends of the lines, Then it was the intersection of the lines. Simple. Chun Chang-sheng stared at the extremely complicated image and said to himself again, 17 monuments, superimposed in front of his eyes. The monuments were the first to disappear. Now they disappeared were the lines. More and more lines were slowly disappearing in front of his eyes, ceaselessly disappearing. More and more blankness slowly appeared in front of his eyes. It kept appearing. The 17 monuments disappeared. The lines on the monuments also disappeared. A new image appeared. It was countless isolated points. Chun Chang-sheng was very sure that he had never seen this image before, but he didn't know why he felt it was familiar. Note: I thought about that sentence for a long time, but I couldn't find a suitable way to describe it. Actually, the most vivid one should be those people thinking that Chun Chang-sheng was acting like an idiot. But it can't be written like this, right? The reason why I specifically mention this point is because I am often told this phrase by others. Yes, but I still prefer Chun Chang-sheng's obsessive-compulsive disorder. This is what classmate QQ Candy concluded. It should be viewed as such. Everyone should also understand the meaning of this chapter's name. It doesn't only refer to viewing the monoliths. It also refers to one's beliefs. Persisting in one's own beliefs is very important. There was another advertisement. According to rumors, Shui Tianji Online will officially start its internal testing on November 7th, 1700. That's right, it's 3 days later. Time really flies. Lastly, this chapter was a bit hard to write. The next chapter will be a bit later. Chapter 231. 17 monoliths, tens of thousands of lines, innumerable dots without any pattern. They looked like a rain of ink on a piece of white paper, a pattern that no one had ever seen before. Then why did it feel familiar? Chun Chang-sheng silently thought. He felt that this pattern gave him the feeling that he had often seen it, but he had never carefully looked at it. Just what was it? The monolith inscriptions had already been simplified into countless dots. The formless paper in his sea of consciousness only had countless dots. And no matter how he looked at it, it was only dots. Dots, 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 a multitude of stars? Even though he was still observing, he seemed to feel that his lips had become somewhat dry. Because of nervousness, the pattern formed by the heavenly tone monoliths of the front mausoleum, could it possibly be the starry sky? In the next moment, he felt an intense lack of confidence and doubt towards his own conjecture, because there were too many dots in front of him, even more than the number of stars in the night sky. If the mausoleum of books of the front mausoleum really did have some sort of connection with the starry sky, then the starry sky was actually more monotonous than the pattern on the monoliths. According to the simplest logic, there was no reason to use a more complicated pattern to describe an even simpler thing. More importantly, if the heavenly tone monoliths of the front mausoleum really did describe the starry sky, then there was no way to simplify it, unless these heavenly tone monoliths depicted many starry skies. But there was only one starry sky in the world. Chun Chang-sheng was silent for a very long time. Then he pushed his thoughts back for a while. A few lines slowly appeared between those dots. If those lines were used to describe the movement of the dots, then the seemingly countless dots on the pattern were actually the positions of a few dots at different times. Then everything could be easily solved. Yes, it should be like this. But now he was faced with another problem. This problem was so difficult to solve that it even made the situation even more dangerous. Because the stars could not move. The brightness of the stars might change slightly, but their positions in the night sky were eternally unchanging. This was a fact that had been proven countless years ago. The countless stargazes of the continent all produced star charts that were basically the same. The focus of observation was also completely concentrated between the brightness and the darkness. No one had ever dared to question this point of view, because this was the truth witnessed by countless people over countless years. Just like how the sun always sets in the west, just like how the moon is always far away and can only be seen by the devil, just like how water always flows downwards. This was the truth that could never be overthrown. When he saw Wang Ji's notes in the pavilion of ascending mist, Qin Changsheng's confusion and doubt towards changing the positions of the stars to defy the heavens and change his fate originated from this. Even after he saw with his own eyes that the Z-Wei Emperor star caused the positions of the surrounding stars to slightly shift, he still didn't believe it because it was an illusion and not something he saw with his own eyes. It was just that Sun Mei's notebook had mentioned several times that when viewing the monoliths, one could see the truth. However, he had been viewing the monoliths in the mausoleum of books for dozens of years, but he had never seen it. In the end, in order to ascend to the top of the mausoleum and see the truth, he had even paid the price of his life. So what truth did he want to see? What was real? Is what you see with your own eyes the truth? Qin Changsheng stopped observing himself. He opened his eyes and looked at the real stone tablet. It was late at night, but there were still many people in the monolith hut. Different from what Qin Changsheng thought, Tang 36, Zhixiu, Gohan Shi, and the others never left. They had always been here watching the process of Qin Changsheng comprehending the monolith, from morning to dusk, until the stars appeared in the night. At dusk, they saw Qin Changsheng spit out blood and were very worried. Then they saw Qin Changsheng clench his fists and raise his eyebrows, as if he had discovered something and seemed a little excited. Now they finally saw Qin Changsheng open his eyes and wake up. Tang 36 let out a sigh of relief and prepared to go forward, but then he stopped, because he realized that Qin Changsheng didn't see him. Qin Changsheng was still looking at the monolith, still comprehending the monolith. His expression was so focused that it made people's hearts palpitate and people didn't want to disturb him. Qin Changsheng had already looked at this monolith for more than 20 days. Morning light and sunset, light rain and clear sky. In different environments, the changes of the monolith inscriptions were all in his mind. He had also looked at this monolith under the starlight and didn't find anything strange. Tonight, the stars were still bright and didn't seem to be any different than a few days ago. But his eyes suddenly lit up. That light came from a very thin, unnoticeable line in the lower left corner of the monolith. There was nothing special about this line. It was just that its position and angle were just right, reflecting the starlight falling from the night sky into his eyes. So his eyes lit up. 20 days of focused observation and contemplation had already allowed him to approach the truth. Tonight's light finally made him understand everything. If the lines on the monolith were to appear or disappear with the natural light, they could become countless words or pictures. Then, where did the changes in brightness of the stars come from? That was because the stars were moving. But if the positions of the stars could move, why had no one ever seen it before? The 17 heavenly tome monoliths once again appeared before his eyes. Those monolith inscriptions overlapped. The lines on the last monolith and the lines on the first monolith were connected in many places, at least in his eyes. But in reality, there was still a very long distance between those lines. The reason why his eyes didn't see this was because his line of sight was perpendicular to the monolith. The monolith's surface was the starry sky. When people stood on the ground and gazed at the starry sky, because the distance between the stars and the ground was too great, it could be said that when gazing at the stars, one's line of sight was always perpendicular to the plane of the stars. So when the stars moved forward or backward, the people standing on the ground naturally couldn't see them. They could only sometimes see them dim or brighten. Yes, it was just like that. Qin Changsheng withdrew his gaze from the monolith, and then realized that there were many people around the monolith hut. Tang 36 looked at him and said with some worry, "Are you all right?" Qin Changsheng looked at him and said, "Positions are relative." This was the first sentence he had seen when he had opened Wang Ji's notebook in the pavilion of ascending mist. Only now did he understand what it meant. Tang 36 did not understand why he would say such a sentence without rhyme or reason, and subconsciously replied, "And then?" Qin Changsheng thought it over, then pointed at the sky full of stars above the mausoleum of books. "Do you see? The stars can move. The surroundings of the monolith hut were quiet. Not a single sound could be heard. Everyone believed that Chen Chongqing had viewed the monoliths for too long, that his mind had been greatly exhausted, and that his mind was somewhat muddled. But for some reason, when they saw the serious expression on his face as he spoke, they felt a vague sense of unease, as if something terrible was about to happen. Ji Jin sternly rebuked him. "What kind of nonsense are you saying?" "But they really are moving," Chen Chongqing calmly said, his tone and expression incomparably certain. "Because this was reality. This was reality." Before updating, I went to the front page to take a look. Heaven Choosing Record is now in first place. I sincerely thank you. Please continue to support the loyal and kind me. I'll take whatever you give me. Thank you. Chapter 232. There was an uproar outside the monolith hut. Chen Chongsheng's words were an attempt to overthrow a truth that no one had ever doubted. The problem was, how could stars move? This was simply too absurd, and no one believed it at all. Go Hanqi only raised his eyebrows, and the uneasiness that had appeared in everyone's hearts disappeared without a trace, and they began to mock him. Chen Chongsheng was not surprised by their reactions. He knew that he was definitely not the first person to discover that the stars could move. At the very least, Wang Jitsa, who had left behind that notebook, must have had this idea a long time ago. So why was it that whether it was in the Taoist canon or in daily discussions, there was never any mention of this? Because there was no way to prove it. What cultivators saw with their faded stars could not be used as evidence, unless they could fly to an extremely high place in the starry sky and let the people on the ground see everything. Chen Chongqing had no way of proving that the stars could move, so the words discovered were actually not accurate. This was only the result of his conjecture from the 17 heavenly tome monoliths of the front mausoleum. It could also be said that it was his comprehension from viewing the monoliths. Conjecture could not convince the world, but it could convince himself because it conformed to his aesthetics and fundamental view of the world. At least for now, it was enough for him to believe that the stars could move. As for whether others believed it or not, he did not care. He looked up at the starry night sky and did not speak again. The stars in the night sky seemed to be motionless, but in fact they were moving all the time, either forward or backward. The distance between them and the ground was sometimes longer and sometimes shorter. The distance and angle between the stars were also constantly changing. It was just that the observers on the ground were too far away from the starry sky to notice the subtle changes between the angles. If the 17 heavenly tome monoliths of the front mausoleum depicted the positions of countless stars and their trajectories of movement, then how could these images be compared to the true starry sky? He lowered his head and closed his eyes, continuing to observe the inscriptions in his sea of consciousness. The 17 heavenly tome monoliths formed a straight line in front of his eyes. The monolith inscriptions overlapped and connected in space, and the countless lines became countless dots. He used his consciousness to once again disassemble these pictures, and then reassemble them. Gradually, those dots began to move along those lines, slowly and smoothly, following an indescribable law. Those patterns were star charts. Countless star charts of different times flashed past his eyes. With time as the axis, countless stars moved continuously in front of his eyes. The stars moved through the night sky, leaving behind traces carved into the stone monoliths. These were the heavenly tome monolith inscriptions of the front mausoleum. Looking from the ground, the stars would always move forward and backward in a fixed position. Therefore, these changing star charts must have been observed from a different angle. Time flowed by slowly. In reality, countless years had already passed, and the final star chart had arrived. Logically speaking, this star chart should be describing the positions of the stars in the real night sky. But for some reason, the positions of the stars in this star chart were completely different from the real starry sky. If at the last moment they suddenly discovered that the result was different from what they had expected, many people's minds would be greatly impacted and might even begin to doubt their previous thoughts. But once Chen Chongsheng's mind was set, it would no longer waver. He looked at the last star chart and remained silent for a long time. Then he raised his right hand and gently flicked the edge of the star chart. The star map was a true reflection, so it was impossible for it to be flat. Instead, it was a cube. Following Chen Chongsheng's finger, the star atlas silently and slowly rotated, changing from the side to the front. It was a new pattern. There are still countless stars on it, but it was more solemn and constant than before. Chen Chongsheng opened his eyes and once again raised his head to look at the night sky. There was a brilliant starry sky. The newest star chart in his sea of consciousness had landed on the real starry sky. It perfectly overlapped with the starry sky in the southeast corner. Not a single star's position was off. All the stars found their own positions on the star chart. This feeling was very beautiful and very shocking. Chen Chongsheng couldn't speak for a long time. Then he thought of more things. Wang Su had once asked a question about this starry sky in the notebook of the Pavilion of Ascending Mist. In the long river of history, countless predecessors had asked similar questions. If the fate of humanity was really hidden in this starry sky, and the positions of the stars were eternal and unchanging, then destiny naturally couldn't be changed. Then why did people have to struggle and work hard to live in this world? In humanity's understanding, the starry sky was forever solemn and perfect. It was like the heavenly Tao and destiny. It couldn't be peeped at and was high above. Tonight, Chen Chongsheng realized that solemnity did not mean rigidity. True perfection did not mean that it would never change, because the stars could move and their positions could be changed. The distance and angle between his fated star and other stars would naturally change. If those connections were the traces of destiny, then didn't that mean that destiny could be changed? At the end of the notebook, Wang Su used all his strength to write 4 words. No destiny. Yes, there was no definite destiny. With a massive boom, Chen Chongsheng's sea of consciousness exploded. He had solved the problem that had plagued him for several years, the most difficult mental anguish to get rid of. He had solved his own heavenly tone monoliths. The mental strength he had comprehended from the 17 heavenly tone monoliths had begun to affect objective reality. In the distant night sky, the dots of starlight were all connected. In his sea of consciousness, all the dots on the superimposed star chart formed by the monolith inscriptions began to light up. Almost at the same time, in the night sky above the mausoleum of books, those stars also seemed to grow brighter. And in the even more distant depths of the sea of stars, in a place that even the spiritual sense of saint-level experts could not perceive, a red star began to emit a boundless radiance. This was true star radiance, a star radiance invisible to the naked eye. Together with the visible starlight, it fell upon the mausoleum of books. The people around the monolith hut were all shocked. They did not know what had happened. In the next moment, they realized with incomparable shock that Chen Chongsheng had disappeared from in front of the monolith hut, like a cool breeze, like a strand of starlight, noiselessly coming and going without hindrance. Chen Chongsheng disappeared from in front of the reflecting monolith. In the next moment, he appeared in front of the cloud-piercing monolith. In front of the cloud-piercing monolith, he paused for a moment, and then his figure disappeared again, reappearing in front of the bent osmanthus monolith. Soon after, he appeared in front of the river guiding monolith, the foul language monolith, and the East Pavilion monolith. In a flash, he appeared in front of the 17 heavenly tone monoliths of the front mausoleum, and then disappeared. Finally, he appeared in front of the broken monolith. His eyes were still closed, oblivious to everything else. He had no idea what had happened. Tonight, there was a strange phenomenon in the sky. When observed with the naked eye, the many stars in the night sky did not seem to grow brighter. But many people knew that those stars had grown brighter. After a little while, even the common people discovered this astonishing fact. A star growing slightly brighter was not easy to see, but if the tens of millions of stars in the southeast region simultaneously grew slightly brighter. Just what sort of scene would that be? The starlight illuminated the mausoleum of books and also illuminated the entire capital. The streets of the late night seemed to have returned to daytime. The dew platform was the closest to the night sky, so it was illuminated to the finest detail. The night pearls at the edge of the platform seemed to dim in contrast. The divine empress stood at the edge of the platform, gazing at the vast starry sky. Her expression was somewhat surprised, even somewhat solemn. She had not imagined that with Chun Changsheng's personality, he would actually return to the monolith hut to comprehend the monoliths. She had not imagined that Chun Changsheng would actually be like that person, comprehending these monoliths of the front mausoleum and attracting countless stars. But even now, she still did not believe that Chun Changsheng could do what that person had done, because the present was no longer the past, and the mausoleum of books was no longer the mausoleum of books of the past. The starlight shone through the window onto the table. The memorials that had been slightly yellowed by the candlelight became somewhat whiter, and the words on them also became somewhat clearer. Emo Yu slightly raised her brows and looked out the window. She thought in shock, could it be that he really understood those heavenly tone monoliths? In the southern city's Bitter Rain Alley, there was a government office. The appearance of the government office was very simple, but in the eyes of the people it seemed especially sinister because this was the great Zhou's department for purging officials. Tonight, the sinister atmosphere of the government office was somewhat dispelled by the bright starlight. Zhou Tong walked into the courtyard and lowered the black gauze in front of his hat, blocking out the somewhat dazzling starlight. He slightly creased his brow, somewhat displeased. Prince Chenlu's words to Tian Haixingxiwe were not true. He had not been waiting for Chun Changsheng outside the mausoleum of books. Even though Chun Changsheng had obtained first rank of the first banner in the grand examination, in his eyes he was still an unremarkable nobody. But now, seeing the sky filled with starlight, he finally had a different thought. Or perhaps it could be said that this sky full of starlight forced him to begin looking at that youth. Starlight filled the world, illuminating the houses and courtyards, and naturally also illuminating the well at New North Bridge. The soil at the bottom of the well had been dug out 2 days ago. A strand of starlight, somewhat miserably, yet stubbornly penetrated into the dark world below. The starlight illuminated the red mole between the little girl's eyebrows, but it could not dispel the indifference between her eyebrows. Luo Luo stood by the railing at the top of the education hall, suddenly raising her head to look at the dome. The night sky here was fake, the stars were eternal and unchanging, but there was no life. She sensed something. Chun Changsheng should be doing something extraordinary. She said to Jin Yulu, "I want to go out." Jin Yulu was silent for a moment, then said, "Sir cannot help him." "Sir does not need my help." Luo Luo said, full of confidence, "I want to go to Orthodox Academy and wait for him, to congratulate him." The starlight illuminated the mausoleum of books and also illuminated the capital. The Li Palace was bathed in the sacred starlight. Several thousand priests and students from the various schools came to the plaza and the Divine Avenue, praying to the sky full of stars, their expressions incomparably pious. In the deepest part of the palace, the Pope looked at the starlight leaking down from the hall, illuminating the green leaf within the basin. His elderly face revealed a loving smile. His Eminence, Archbishop Mei Li Sha, gazed at the snow-like starlight outside the hall, sighing with emotion, just like back then. The Pope knew that he was referring to the scene when Wang Ji comprehended the Tao and broke through. That night, the entire capital lit up. Tonight, the scene from back then reappeared. This scene had not appeared for several hundred years. Mei Li Sha suddenly frowned, asking in confusion, "This is star condensation?" The Pope said, "No, he is still at ethereal opening." Mei Li Sha asked, "Then why is the starry sky so bright?" The Pope thought about it, then said with some hesitation, Perhaps he is using star condensation to continue his ethereal opening. This chapter has a line from the principal's lyrics. The chapter's title is Gala Style. I really like it because it's especially brilliant, especially carrying on the past and opening up the future, especially fitting for Qin Changsheng. Today there is only one chapter, but if everyone is happy reading it, please cast a few more votes. Monthly votes and recommended votes are all extremely good. Just now, before the update, I saw on the page of Heaven's Chosen Diary that the Heaven's Chosen Diary's in-house testing will begin on the 7th of November. There really is only 2 days left. The producer is extremely nervous. Even someone as thick as me was actually affected by him. I hope everyone will have fun when the time comes. Chapter 233. Even a saint like His Holiness, was unable to ascertain Chen Changsheng's current situation. That was because Chen Changsheng's cultivation had been different from the others from the very beginning. He had walked a path that no one had ever walked before. He had already violated the common sense or laws of cultivation many times, and had many bizarre and unbelievable aspects. Before he had completed his purification, he had already begun meditative introspection, nearly dying and his soul returning to the starry sky. After he had received the Black Dragon's help, he had survived this dangerous trial, and then faced a desperate situation in the Grand Examination, breaking into his ethereal opening in the autumn rain. As it turned out, while he had thought that he was absorbing starlight for purification, he had actually been an ethereal opening. He had always been cultivating with methods that surpassed his true realm. He was like a baby who had already tried to run before he could walk. He had already memorized the Taoist canon before he could even speak. He had already tried to learn how to fight when he didn't even have the strength to lift his sword. This was definitely a very dangerous thing. In fact, if it weren't for these fortuitous encounters, he would have died long ago. Starlight shone upon the mausoleum of books, illuminating the meadow until it looked like a snow-white blanket. Chen Changsheng sat in front of the broken monolith, his eyes tightly closed. His sea of consciousness and the starry sky reflected each other, the world and his body constantly fusing. The countless stars in the night sky looked down on him, who was at the ethereal opening realm, to begin star condensation ahead of time. The aura he exuded continued to rise, constantly probing into the surrounding heaven and earth. It was like the broken stubble of a broken monolith piercing into the night sky like a sword. Invisible starlight accompanied the bright starlight and fell on the eaves, fell on the monolith, fell on his body, and continuously surged into his body, bringing with it gusts of slightly cold night wind. If he could break through this barrier, his future would be limitless. With the chilly night wind, many people arrived outside the mausoleum of books. The orthodoxy's 6 prefects had arrived, with Mei Lisha standing at the very front. The head of the Tianhai clan had arrived. Jin Yulu had arrived. Mao Qiyu had arrived. And Mo Yu also came. They did not enter the mausoleum. Relying on their powerful spiritual senses, they silently observed what was happening in front of the broken monolith. Qin Changsheng was still a step away from breaking through that barrier, but no one knew if he could break through successfully, and even if he did, to what extent he could break through. In his body, the door to the ethereal palace had already slowly opened. The limitless clear water that enveloped the spirit mountain was currently flowing incessantly. The flow of the water grew faster and faster, forming many whirlpools. The fallen leaves on the mountain path danced everywhere, constantly slapping against the stone steps in front of the door. Although it was silent, it was hair-raising. The ethereal palace was in the spirit mountain, and the spirit mountain was in the lake formed from the radiance of the stars. More and more starlight poured into his body, and the lake water became more and more unrestrained, gradually turning into a vast ocean. The embankment could burst at any time. Even though this floating lake had no embankment, countless rays of light refracted in the lake water. As the lake water fluctuated, they gradually condensed and gathered together, turning into shining spots of light like stars. The stars in the night sky appeared in Chen Chongqing's consciousness and then appeared in the lake. The position of each star was exactly the same. It was just that this starry sky felt incomplete, as if something was missing. This starry sky was the 17 heavenly tone monoliths of the front mausoleum. But the front mausoleum originally had 18 monoliths. The last monolith had broken, so the monolith inscriptions naturally no longer existed. Chen Chongsheng did not see those monolith inscriptions, so the star atlas in his mind was naturally missing a piece. If this starry sky could not be filled, then there was no need to mention anything else. In the plaza of the Li Palace, the Pope looked in the direction of the mausoleum of books, extending his hand to receive the starlight falling from the night sky. After a moment of silence, he said, "If only that monolith was still here." On the dew platform, the divine empress looked at the night sky, her expression indifferent as she thought, without those monoliths, how could the mausoleum of books of today still be the mausoleum of books of the past? Many years ago, Zhou Dufu saw all 18 monoliths in one day, and then, for some reason, he did not want others to be like him. So he took a monolith with him. From that day onwards, the 17 monoliths of the front mausoleum came into being. For many years, Chen Chongsheng was the person closest to completely comprehending the monoliths of the front mausoleum. The problem was that he could not see that lost monolith, so it was highly likely that he would forever be infinitely close to the truth, but unable to touch it. Seeing the starry sky gradually taking shape in the lake, Chen Chongsheng instinctively sensed that this starry sky was incomplete. He knew that what was missing was the monolith inscription of the broken monolith. He silently pondered, but could not understand. His mind wandered for 10,000 li, but he could not see the monolith. Gradually, his mind became more and more chaotic, until it became somewhat muddle-headed. Just at this moment, the dagger at his waist began to violently tremble. A piece of black stone appeared on the wasteland. The wasteland was covered in snow, and that snow was also the radiance of the stars. At this moment, Chen Chongqing had already forgotten himself. He did not know what was happening in the outside world, nor did he know what was happening in his body. That clear lake in the sky absorbed countless rays of light, condensed countless rays of light, and was incomparably bright. If one were to look down from above, this lake was like a very large glass bead. The curved surface of the water was extremely smooth and could magnify one's surroundings. The black stone beneath the lake was magnified countless times. In the pavilion of ascending mist, when Chen Chongsheng had touched this black stone, he had experienced a mental journey. He knew that this black stone was definitely not an ordinary object. It could even be the key to defying the heavens and changing one's fate. He had once carefully examined it, but he couldn't find anything special on the black stone. The black stone was not large and could be grasped in one hand. It was warm and smooth, without even the smallest crack on its surface. If he opened his eyes now, he would definitely be extremely shocked. As it turned out, only by magnifying it countless times could one see that the black stone originally had countless, extremely fine lines. Those lines were extremely complex, as numerous as the traces of water, without any sort of rule. It was impossible for them to have been carved by man. If one looked carefully, perhaps one could discover that those lines were just like the monolith inscriptions of the heavenly tone monoliths. The black stone suddenly became bright, just like in the pavilion of ascending mist. Those fine lines on the surface of the black stone also began to brighten. They were projected into the lake, becoming bright rays of light. Then, just like the other heavenly tone monolith inscriptions, these rays of light constantly condensed and shrank, becoming countless specks of light. Each speck of light was a star, and when these countless specks of light came together, they became a small part of the starry sky. Just like that, the incomplete starry sky was filled up. A humming sound rang out. Chen Chongsheng's sea of consciousness violently shook. The countless stars within the lake simultaneously gave off a brilliant light. finally condensing into an extremely thick pillar of light, falling upon the great door of his ethereal palace. A few days ago, in the Tower of Purging Dust, the door to his ethereal palace had been pushed open halfway. Tonight, under the impact of the pillar of starlight, it had finally been completely opened. Yesterday I said on Weibo, in order to fix my update time and allow everyone to read more easily, I've decided to save up chapters. Therefore, I can save them. I've already finished writing the next chapter. I'll go make some amendments. I'll be able to update it in about half an hour. There's definitely no need for everyone to wait until late at night. Chapter 234. The starlight spilling over the mausoleum of books and the starlight pouring into Qin Changxing's ethereal palace reflected each other. The starlight fell on his body and the broken monolith like snow. His spiritual sense followed the wind and snow, disappearing to some unknown place. The starlight also fell on other places, such as the reflecting monolith. The lines on the monolith grew brighter and brighter, flashing from time to time, as if mercury was flowing within. He could not see the reflecting monolith, but he could see the monolith inscriptions. Unknowingly, Qin Changxing's true essence was like the mercury flowing on the monolith inscriptions, beginning to flow through his meridians. Those originally somewhat withered rivers and streams, with the nourishment of true essence, gradually became exuberant with life. Finally, the clear water fell into the abyss below the cliff. It seemed the same as before, but vaguely there seemed to be some sort of hope. No matter how bottomless the abyss was, as long as the water endlessly poured down, there would inevitably come a day when it would be filled up, right? The starlight also fell on the second heavenly tome monolith. The lines appeared bright and dark, as if the spiritual sense was floating in the void, its position difficult to determine. Qin Changxing's spiritual sense moved, going to a certain river banked tens of thousands of li away. Suddenly, it returned to the river guiding monolith. As he went back and forth, an indescribable law had already been branded into his soul. The starlight fell on the 17 heavenly tome monoliths of the front mausoleum. The countless methods of comprehending the monoliths that had been discovered by his predecessors fell like snow, drifted like leaves, appearing one by one in his sea of consciousness. Then they began to display their effects in his body. His meridians received an unprecedented nourishment. His spiritual sense received an unprecedented nourishment, and his qi constantly rose. Time slowly passed. He closed his eyes in front of the broken monolith, waiting for that moment to arrive. The starlight illuminated the capital. The dew platform was still burning, but the light it emitted was cold, like an icy flame. The divine empress stood in the indescribably beautiful icy flame, looking in the direction of the mausoleum of books in silence. That monolith had long since disappeared from the mausoleum, so how could Qin Changxing still fill up that starry sky? The mausoleum of books was enveloped in the snow-like starlight, and the surroundings of the monolith hut were quiet. Go Hanqi, Zhuang Huanyu, Tang 36, and the other young monolith viewers all had different expressions as they looked at the flowing mercury on the monolith's lines. They could not be sure what had happened tonight, but they knew that it definitely had something to do with Qin Changxing. Go Hanqi suddenly raised his head and gazed towards the complicated region of stars in the southeast corner. After a moment, he began to walk towards the monolith hut. Zhexiu followed closely behind and entered the monolith hut. Soon after, Tang 36, Qi Jian, and the others did not hesitate. They also entered the monolith hut and disappeared, heading towards their own heavenly tome monoliths. They did not know why the mausoleum of books was as bright as day to night, but they knew that many years ago, when Wang Jitze broke through, there had been a phenomenon in the capital. They could clearly sense that the starlight tonight was much denser than usual. Even their own faded stars were much more active than usual, as if they were waiting for them. In the opinion of cultivators, how could they miss such an opportunity? especially when most of them had arrived at the critical moment of breaking through after viewing the steel for over 20 days, so they had to grab hold of every opportunity and timing. Not long after Sin Hanchi and the others entered the monolith hut and disappeared in front of the reflecting monolith, an extremely clear and long whistle suddenly rang out from within the mausoleum. This clear whistle came from in front of the East Pavilion's monolith. The Divine State's third law, Liang Xiao Xiao, stood in front of the monolith hut, his expression as cold and arrogant as usual. Only his slightly trembling right hand betrayed the excitement in his heart. After breaking through several months ago, his cultivation had stagnated, and even his viewing of the monoliths had stopped. But tonight, by borrowing the starlight, he had unexpectedly broken through to the middle level of ethereal opening, in front of another monolith hut. From his bosom, Tang 36 took out the medicine box that Chen Changsheng had given him a few days ago. He took out a pill from the box and gave it to Zhixio. Afterwards, he swallowed the rest of the pill and closed his eyes. Zhixio glanced at him, then swallowed them as well. Go Henshi glanced at the two, then gave the medicines that the Mountly Sword Sect had prepared to Guan Feibai and Liang Banhu. Without further delay, he went to the next monolith hut and gave the rest of the pills to Qi Jian. Only then did he slowly leave. This was the third heavenly tone monolith, the bent osmanthus monolith. It was still spring, so there were no osmanthus flowers in the mountains. He could not see the bits of gold, nor could he smell the sweet osmanthus fragrance that Tang 36 loathed. But for some reason, the area around the bent osmanthus monolith hut was suddenly filled with an extremely thick fragrance. Perhaps it was the fragrance emitted by the astonishingly talented youths outside the monolith hut that were using their true essence to transform the pills. Papa, an extremely fragmented, yet somewhat hair-raising sound came from within Zhixio's body. It sounded as if all of his bones had been smashed into pieces. Soon after, the sound of water boiling came from within his body. Following that, more and more sounds of water boiling came from all around the monolith hut. The bodies of the youths that were sitting cross-legged outside the monolith hut with their eyes closed were gradually wrapped up in a white mist. Boiling. This was the sound of star radiance and true essence burning. This was the sound of those spiritual mountains' ethereal palace being incessantly pushed. After an unknown period of time, Tang 36 opened his eyes. The usual playfulness in his eyes had long since disappeared. All that was left was solemnity and tranquility, incomparably serene. In the depths of his black pupils, there seemed to be the remaining light of the burning star radiance. This proved that his ethereal palace had already opened. Tang 36 had entered ethereal opening. Guan Feibai then opened his eyes and spat out a mouthful of impure qi. A hot mist drifted from the corner of his lips. Liang Banhu opened his eyes and looked around the monolith hut. His face revealed a trace of naive happiness. He seemed extremely happy. The two disciples of the Mountly Sword Sect had reached ethereal opening. Soon after, Su Mo had reached ethereal opening. The senior sister of Holy Maiden Peak had reached ethereal opening. The students of Star Caesar Academy had reached ethereal opening. The two young scholars of Scholatry Manor had reached ethereal opening. Outside the bent osmanthus monolith, countless people had reached ethereal opening. In front of the river guiding monolith, 7 people had reached ethereal opening. In front of the mausoleum of books, everyone had reached ethereal opening. The starlight fell on the mausoleum of books like snow. When someone broke through to ethereal opening, the qi outside the monolith hut would be disturbed. The snow-like starlight would slightly bend and scatter like a flower. It was exceptionally beautiful. Tang 36 stood in front of the bent osmanthus monolith and gently rubbed his fingers together, smelling the sweet fragrance of the flowers. He suddenly felt that the osmanthus flowers were not so unbearable after all. The starlight fell on his body and splashed like water, scattering into the night sky. Not far away, where Liang Banhu and Guan Feibai stood, starlight also splashed into the night sky. Outside the bent osmanthus monolith hut, tensum starlight splashed into the night sky. Similar scenes appeared in front of many monolith huts in the front mausoleum of books. In the darkness of the night, the mausoleum of books was lush with trees. Even though it was shrouded in starlight, it was still somewhat gloomy. At this moment, in the mountain mausoleum, tensum starlight splashed and silver flowers could be seen everywhere. It was too beautiful to behold. Tang 36 looked at Jishyo. The snow-white starlight made his face even paler. The occasional flush of red was a sign of the tide rush of blood. His true essence had been controlled by Chun Chongqing's copper needles, and he had taken many medicines. It was abnormally dangerous. This was also one of the reasons why, compared to other monolith viewers, he had not been able to reach ethereal opening. The other reason was naturally because of his bewitching bloodline. Suddenly, several mournful howls of wind could be heard in front of the monolith hut. Several deep slashes appeared on the eaves. Extremely sharp claws protruded from the tips of Jeshyo's fingers, suffused with a metallic luster. Many gray hairs sprouted from his face, and his eyes became incomparably bright red, giving off a bloody aura. Suddenly, a powerful aura burst forth from his body. He raised his head and let out a howl. Awoo! This mournful howl was filled with unwillingness and anger, filled with contempt and pride. His howl was directed at the stars in the night sky, and even more so at that bright ball of light in the extreme north. I've won! Within the mausoleum of books, the starlight fell upon the bodies of the youths, breaking into ethereal opening, splashing and scattering like fireworks. It was very beautiful. If one looked at it from outside the mausoleum, it would seem like the entire mausoleum was incessantly releasing fireworks. The scene was still beautiful, but it was even more shocking. At the very front of the divine path of the mausoleum of books was a pavilion. The pavilion was surrounded by shallow canals, clear water flowing through them. Tonight, these clear canals were first covered in a thin layer of frost, and then they were illuminated by the countless fireworks in the mountain mausoleum. Under the pavilion, the dusty armor was also illuminated by the fireworks. The rust-stained helmet flashed and flashed. The person in the armor had woken up. An extremely ancient voice came out of the helmet, sounding somewhat oppressive. As expected, it's the season for the blooming of wildflowers. As the continent's first divine general, the old man had left the front lines of the war against the demons to guard the mausoleum for several hundred years. He was guarding the future of humanity. When he saw the fireworks tonight, he was naturally gratified, and then he silently thanked two people in his heart. One was called Sun Mei, and the other was called Qin Chongsheng. Those important figures outside the mausoleum had come to see Qin Chongsheng, but they had not expected to see such a shocking scene. In a single night, several dozen monolith viewers had collectively entered ethereal opening. Such a scene had never appeared before in history. The garden outside the mausoleum was silent, with the occasional long sigh. The fireworks gradually quieted, the starlight dimmed, and the mausoleum gradually returned to normal. The important figures of the orthodoxy, the imperial court, and the various schools and sects made an exception and entered the mausoleum, waiting below. Tonight, there were too many young cultivators breaking through. Some broke into ethereal opening, some entered the middle level, and some succeeded in star condensation. To humanity, this was, without question, a fruitful night. They had to personally take care of the aftermath. They could not allow any problems to occur at this time. Chun Chongsheng woke up and realized that he was sitting cross-legged in front of the broken monolith. He looked at the sky, thought about it, and confirmed that it was still 5 o'clock. It was just before dawn. He stood up and walked along the meadow to the edge of the cliff. The waterfall at the bottom of the cliff still emitted a soul-stirring sound. He did not sweat, did not feel tired, and did not feel sore. It was as if nothing had happened. but he knew that many things had already happened. It was darkest before dawn. The starlight was not enough to illuminate the distant capital, but in his eyes the capital was very clear. Every street, even the great banyan tree of the Orthodox Academy, seemed to be in front of him. The morning light gradually came, disappearing into the starry sky, line by line. But he knew that those stars were still above his head. He could clearly sense his fated star. This was the first time he had sensed his fated star in the daytime. The morning sun leaped over the horizon. The warm red light fell on his face. He did not know why. He did not know why. He did not know that such a magnificent scene had occurred in the mausoleum last night. He did not know that he had become the youngest upper-level ethereal opening cultivator in history. But he still felt very moved. Today I wrote this chapter with great joy. I hope that everyone also read it with great joy. If everyone votes for me more monthly and recommended votes, then I will be even more overjoyed. In addition, there are also friends who have asked me through various channels for the activation code for the heaven-choosing online game. In truth, tomorrow's official beta testing does not require an activation code. After registering, you can directly log into the game and play. Yes, tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Chapter 235. Facing the red morning sun. Chen Chongqing spread out his hands and did something that completely violated the rules of cultivation. In hindsight, he did not know why he did what he did back then. It was just like how he was moved for no reason at all. He wanted to do it, so he did it. He spread out his hands and found his fated star in the sky that was turning from gray to blue, then began to draw in starlight. This was the first time he had attempted to draw in starlight for purification in the daytime. Perhaps it was also the first time in countless years that an ordinary cultivator had attempted to draw in starlight for purification in the daytime. Perhaps it was because he was lucky, but he did not die, nor was he burned to ashes. On the contrary, he could clearly feel that after the gate to his ethereal palace was completely opened, the speed at which he drew in starlight was several hundred times faster than before. Yes, there were still many places where his meridians were broken, especially in the middle of the 7 most important meridians. The precipice of tens of thousands of zhang still existed, but in those broken meridians, especially in the organs around his ethereal palace, the true essence transformed from star radiance was unprecedentedly abundant. It even seemed to have healed some of the injuries to his meridians. Could this be the mystical aspect of the heavenly tome monoliths? He turned to look at the broken monolith under the hut and silently thought. At this moment, he was standing on the edge of the cliff. The two places were rather far apart, and he could not see clearly, but he felt that he could see that lost monolith, and that his eyes were not playing tricks on him. At this point, Chen Chongsheng had truly comprehended all the heavenly tome monoliths of the front mausoleum, accomplishing what Zhou Dufu had accomplished all those years ago. If he continued forward, he would probably enter other mausoleums and see those even more mystical, heavenly tome monoliths. But he glanced at the sky and did not continue. He left. The mausoleum of books was very quiet in the morning. The fireworks from last night were no longer there. There was no one in front of the 17 monolith huts, and no one on the mountain path leading down. Many people were sleeping and had not awoken, or they would only wake up after many days. Breaking through had never been a simple matter. Not everyone could be like Chen Chongsheng, who seemed to casually cross the threshold and didn't even feel a trace of tiredness. Of course, for some people, breaking through was not too difficult, such as Go Hanshi. Go Hanshi stood at the end of the mountain path, quietly waiting for him. Chun Chongsheng walked in front of him and saluted with his hands folded in front of him. Looking at the faint light in his eyes, he knew that his cultivation level had also increased. From the Ivy Festival to the Grand Examination, and then to the Mausoleum of Books, the two of them finally reached the same level of cultivation, the upper level of ethereal opening. Chun Chongsheng bid farewell to him and said, "I'm leaving." Go Hanshi said, "There are still a few days until the garden of Zhou opens. There should be enough time." Chun Chongsheng said, In the capital, there are still some things that need to be handled and prepared. Go Hanshi was silent for a while, then said, I'm not planning on going to the Garden of Zhou. Take care of yourself on the road. Chun Changsheng was confused and asked, What are you doing here? At the very least, I have to finish reading all 17 monuments in the front mausoleum, Go Hanshi said with a smile. Chun Changsheng said sincerely, I wish you success. Go Han sure looked at him and said, All of the examinees in this grand examination should thank you. Chun Changsheng didn't understand, so Go Han sure explained what happened last night. He thought about it and said, No need to thank me. I only did what I wanted to do. Go Han sure knew that he wasn't being modest, because he really only wanted to comprehend the monoliths himself. As for the starlight that illuminated the capital and the mausoleum of books, it didn't move according to his will. The two walked side by side towards the grass hut, crossing over the fence that had just been repaired not even 2 days ago. Chun Changsheng entered the hut and began to pack his luggage. He looked at the thunderously snoring Tang 36 and shook his head, but found that Jeshia wasn't in the hut, so he couldn't help but feel a little depressed. Carrying his luggage and walking out, he said to Go Hanshi, I'll have to trouble you to help me take care of Tang Tang. Go Hanshi said, No problem, but you have to understand, after leaving the mausoleum of books, we will still be opponents. Chun Changsheng said, I understand. Go Hanshi said again, Third Junior and Junior will go to the Garden of Zhou. When they're inside, help take care of them. Chun Changsheng was a little confused and said, You just said that we are opponents. Go Hanshi said, Opponents doesn't mean we can't take care of each other. Chun Changsheng thought about it and said, That makes sense, but I really don't think I have the ability to take care of them. Liang Xiaoxiao and Qi Jian were part of the Divine State Seven Laws and were disciples of the Mount Li Sword sect with astonishing sword techniques. Although Chun Changsheng was at the upper level of ethereal opening and had abundant true essence, because of his meridians, the amount of true essence he could use was still very little. If they were to really fight to the death, he might not be able to defeat them, let alone take care of them. Go Hanshi laughed and said, What I value is your ability in other areas. Leaving the grass hut and arriving at the stone gate of the mausoleum of books, Go Hanshi saw him off. The ground trembled slightly, and the stone gate slowly opened. To cultivators, the mausoleum of books was the highest and only holy land. No matter who it was, when they left the mausoleum of books, they would presumably feel some reluctance or even more complicated emotions. Chun Changsheng's expression was very calm. Just like that, he casually walked out of the stone gate and did not even look back. Go Hanshi and the monolith guardians who had heard the news saw this scene and could not help but feel that it was a little strange. Just like many people had said, Chun Changsheng was too calm and steady in the face of anything, completely unlike a 15-year-old youth. That was because he treasured his time, and now that he had found his own path, he naturally had to treasure it even more. Moreover, he believed that there would definitely be a day when he could enter the Saint Realm. On that day, he would once again return to the mausoleum of books. Whether it was breaking through the divine path or walking the old path, there would be no problems, so why was there a need to be reluctant to part now? If that day did not come, then, after a few years, he would return to the starry sky. What meaning was there in being reluctant to part? After viewing the monoliths for more than 20 days, especially since the day before yesterday, he had been viewing the monoliths without sleep or rest. In the end, he had successfully broken through to the upper level of ethereal opening. Besides this, there was another very important gain, and that was that he understood the last sentence that Wang Jitsa had written in his notebook. There is no fate. Since the stars could move, naturally there was no fixed and unchanging fate. Perhaps his master, Taoist Ji, had him enter the pavilion of ascending mist to find Wang Jitsa's notebook, because he wanted him to learn the secret method that Emperor Taizu and Emperor Taizong used to change fate. It was just that Taoist Ji did not expect that what he had comprehended in the mausoleum of books would lead him onto a different path. He had an unprecedented belief that he could change his own fate, and that he did not need to change the fate of others to change his own fate. He wanted to enter the concealed divinity realm before the age of 20. Yes, no one in this world had ever done it before. But who said that he definitely could not do it? In the forest, Mao Qiuyu and the principal of Star Caesar Academy looked at Chen Chongqing's figure with somewhat complicated emotions. The principal of Star Caesar Academy said, "He should be the youngest upper-level ethereal opening cultivator in history." Mao Qiuyu nodded and said, "Even earlier than MOU by 2 years." After the grand examination, Chen Chongqing became one of the youngest ethereal opening cultivators. After viewing the monoliths in the mausoleum of books, he became the youngest upper-level ethereal opening cultivator. From this point of view, he seemed to be really good at making many things that seemed impossible possible. Walking into the quiet and secluded forest and seeing the youth standing under the tree, Chen Chongqing could not help but be slightly startled. Someone had actually left the mausoleum of books earlier than him. After leaving the mausoleum, there is a new world. People who have never appeared will always appear, just like our world. Due to certain reasons, a few friends were unable to update the world of creation. Recently, they have returned one after another. My old friend Ao Jiantianqiong, the little knife-sharp blade, returned to update the world of creation after nearly 3 million words. I am really happy for him. The books are already very plentiful. I will enthusiastically recommend them for him here. Also, Chosen Heaven Online is officially undergoing internal testing today. If anyone finds any problems, please quickly say so that I can let the manufacturer fix them. Thank you all for your hard work. The next chapter should be updated before 10:30. Yes, I said yesterday that I would save the manuscript, but now I do not have a single word in my hands. Let us continue to work hard together. Chen Chongqing also has to go outside the mausoleum to work hard. Let us see who has a better life. Chapter 236. The youth under the tree was Zheshio. Chen Chongqing looked at his pale face and the blood stain on the corner of his lips. He asked confusedly, "Why are you here?" Zheshio expressionlessly said, "I'll go with you to the garden of Zhou." Chen Chongqing was a little surprised. After a moment of silence, he said, "There might be danger." Zheshio remained expressionless and said, "So I want to go with you to the garden of Zhou." Chen Chongqing asked why. "Tang Tang has already paid," Zheshio said, "so I will follow you and ensure your safety." Chen Chongqing was slightly surprised and said, "You are going to be my bodyguard?" "Yes." Zheshio paused for a moment, then continued, "Of course, if the Garden of Zhou is too dangerous, you'll have to pay more afterwards." Until now, Chen Chongqing still wasn't used to this wolf tribe youngster's way of thinking. He shrugged helplessly and said, "But I don't need a bodyguard." Zheshio glanced at him and said, "Even though you're already at the upper level of ethereal opening, if the two of us were to be locked in the same forest, the one who would survive in the end would definitely be me." In reality, if the duels and the grand examination didn't have so many restrictions, making it inconvenient to be too ruthless, even if Gohan sure could defeat me, he wouldn't be able to kill me. In the end, he would still be killed by me. Hearing these words, Chen Chongqing felt somewhat uncomfortable, because he knew that Zheshio's words were correct. Zheshio's next words finally made him make up his mind. "And you have to treat my illness." Chen Chongqing thought about it and said, "Then let's go together." Zheshio very naturally took the bag from his shoulder and walked out of the forest. Chen Chongqing hurriedly followed up and said uneasily, "Bodyguard is fine, but how can I let you do this kind of rough work?" Zheshio remained expressionless and ignored him. Chen Chongqing said, "Then I won't give you more money." Zheshio stopped, thought about it, and said, "This counts as a gift." The two of them didn't like to talk much and were very quiet among their peers. They walked out of the forest in silence. Jin Yulu was waiting for them on the other side of the bridge. The wheels of the carriage rolled over the hard stone pavement, creaking and creaking. The brand-new gate of the Orthodox Academy was fiercely pushed open from the inside. Xian Yuan ran out from inside. Kuei Wu's body was like a small mountain, causing the ground to tremble non-stop. Smoke and dust flew everywhere from the cracks of the stone steps. Qin Changxing and Zhixiu walked out of the carriage. Xian Yuan said with a simple and honest smile, "You came out so early. It seems like you didn't get anything out of the steel?" Zhixiu slightly creased his brow and looked at Chen Changsheng. Chen Changsheng felt a little embarrassed and explained. He was just being sarcastic, he didn't mean it. "I'm not Tang 36. Xian Yuan said, somewhat unhappily. Afterwards, he noticed Zhixiu's existence and said with slight surprise, "It's actually you? Don't tell me you've actually gone all the way to the Mausoleum of Books to collect your debt? Why are you in such a hurry? When has our country's Orthodox Academy ever refused to pay when it owed money?" Jin Yulu asked with a serious face, "When will I be paid?" The concierge also has to support his family. The three youths looked at him without saying a word. Jin Yulu was a little embarrassed and said, "I know, I don't suit the word humor. You guys continue. Zhixiu isn't here to collect a debt." Qin Changsheng said to Xian Yuan, but he didn't know how to explain Zhixiu's identity. After thinking for a while, he said, "He's here to take a look at Orthodox Academy." The wolf tribe youth, Zhixiu, was very famous in the Yao domain. Xian Yuan knew that he wasn't here for money, so he naturally returned to the position of a Yao youth. He looked at Zhixiu with a face full of admiration and said, "I heard from the elders in the tribe that you could already kill demon snakes at the age of 3. Zhixiu ignored him. Xian Yuan followed him into Orthodox Academy and continued to ask, "I heard that you killed demons at the age of 7. Zhixiu continued to ignore him. Xian Yuan Po's enthusiasm didn't diminish and said, "It seems that you don't intend to return to the snow plains immediately. Why don't you just enter our Orthodox Academy?" Zhixiu stopped his steps. Qin Changsheng also stopped and looked at him. Zhixiu thought for a while, looked at Xian Yuan and said, "I'm afraid I'll become stupid if I stay with a black bear like you." As a Yao, he could naturally tell what Xian Yuan Po's true form was. Xian Yuan Po's expression suddenly became serious and said seriously, "Remove the first word, or else I'll get angry." Zhixiu said, "Okay, black bear." Xian Yuan became angry and shouted, "Why are you as annoying as Tang 36? Qin Changsheng returned to the small building, washed up, then went to bed and slept. He didn't rest last night and was very tired. His mind had already calmed down and was no longer agitated, leaving only satisfaction and warmth. Therefore, he slept very soundly, to the point that he didn't notice that someone had entered the room. Moyu sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the youth's clean and delicate appearance. She slightly raised her eyebrows and said something to him, smelling the air and smell in the room that had become real again. She didn't know why her mood became much better. She lifted up a corner of Chen Changsheng's blanket and crawled into it. She quickly fell asleep, but even in her dreams, her eyes were like flowers. If the eunuchs in the royal palace or the ministers of the court saw her like this, they would definitely think that they were seeing things. Outside the window, a patter of spring rain fell. Moyu opened her eyes and woke up. She lazily stretched her waist and turned around to see Chen Changsheng sleeping soundly against her waist. Only then did she feel a little embarrassed. Her beautiful face blushed, and she hurriedly got up and left, disappearing into the spring rain outside the window. Not long after, the door was pushed open and Luo walked in. Seeing Chen Changsheng sleeping soundly, she happily ran over and was about to jump onto the bed, but she smelled a light scent of cosmetics. She furrowed her thin eyebrows and moved closer to Qin Changsheng's neck on the bed. She took a serious sniff and immediately became angry. She stomped her feet, and the pearl-like raindrops on her temples rustled down. Even though she stomped her feet because she was angry, She didn't really stomp because she didn't want to wake Qin Changsheng up. She looked at the spring rain outside the window and angrily scolded, "Mo you, you shameless woman!" She closed the window and blocked the gentle spring rain and wind outside. The little building was now unified. She felt that no shameless woman would come and harass her master anymore. Only then did she relax. She moved the stool to the bedside and smiled at Qin Changsheng's face. She didn't say anything and didn't do anything. She just quietly looked at him and felt very satisfied. Qin Changsheng woke up. He felt that his left arm was tightly held and listened to the calm and relaxed breath. He didn't need to open his eyes to know who came. He smiled. After being held for a long time, it was always a little hard. That sour and comfortable feeling was so familiar. How could he not know who it was? He opened his eyes and saw that Luo Luo was indeed sitting by the bed. He did not know how long she had been here. Perhaps it was because she was tired from sitting, but just like in the past, her hands were wrapped around his arm out of habit, hanging onto his body. However, she was still sitting on the stool. This posture was a little awkward, but of course it was also quite cute. Her eyelashes trembled slightly and Luo Luo woke up. She rubbed her eyes in confusion. Seeing that Qin Changsheng was looking at her, she woke up. She was a little shy, but also happy. She called out in a clear voice, "Master." "Good girl." Qin Changsheng touched her little face. The two left the little building and went to the library. They sat for a while and waited for Xian Yuan Pa and Zhixio to come over. They talked about the mausoleum of books. At noon, Jin Yu Lu prepared lunch. After eating, Qin Changsheng and Luo Luo strolled around the Orthodox Academy. The spring rain was like powder. They didn't need an umbrella. When they climbed up the great banyan tree, their feet were a little slippery. Looking at the capital in the drizzle, Luo Luo was silent for a while. She turned to him and asked, "Master, you want to go to the Garden of Zhou?" After spending so much time with Qin Changsheng in the Orthodox Academy, she could be said to be the person who understood Qin Changsheng the most in the world. She was very clear that if he didn't have a reason to leave the mausoleum of books, a person who valued time and opportunities like her master wouldn't so easily leave the mausoleum of books and those heavenly tome monoliths. Qin Changsheng said yes. Luo Luo widened her eyes and asked in confusion, "Why?" Not waiting for Qin Changsheng's answer, she lowered her head and looked at the pond under the banyan tree that was rippling due to the rain. She said softly, "Is it because Master's wife also wants to go to the Garden of Zhou?" Qin Changsheng was startled. He then realized that the wife she was talking about was Su Yurong. Although he had never thought about marrying Su Yurong, Luo Luo's way of addressing him still made him feel a little awkward. He said, "What does it have to do with her? Only those at ethereal opening can enter the Garden of Zhou. Although her talent is astonishing, it's not like she hasn't broken through." Last night, the mausoleum of books had been illuminated by starlight for an entire night. Dozens of people had broken through to ethereal opening. Now that he thought about it, Su Yurong, who was ranked first on the proclamation of azure clouds, paled in comparison. Master's wife has already broken through to ethereal opening a few days ago. Luo Luo seemed to have understood something. She once again returned to her usual innocent and lively appearance. She happily smiled and said, "The blood that flows through her body is the blood of the true phoenix." Such a proud person. Even if she doesn't care about being surpassed by Master, how could she be surpassed by those mediocre people? Qin Changsheng was slightly startled. He needed some time to digest this sudden news. The first thing he thought of was that the proclamation of azure clouds would soon change. "Congratulations." He looked at Luo Luo and said with a smile. Luo Luo mumbled, "What's there to be happy about?" Su Yurong had broken through to ethereal opening. Naturally, she would leave the proclamation of azure clouds. Last night, so many people had broken through to ethereal opening. If they left the mausoleum of books, they would also leave the proclamation of azure clouds. The value of the current first place on the proclamation of azure clouds had greatly decreased. Chun Chang Sheng extended his hand to take her pulse and said, "The bloodlines of the Yao race and the human race are somewhat different, especially for your White Emperor clan. Your innate bloodline is far too tyrannical and powerful. Therefore, even at the meditation realm, you can still defeat many ethereal opening opponents. Therefore, you don't need to worry too much about it. It's just that if you want to break through to ethereal opening, the difficulty will be somewhat greater." Thinking of this, he couldn't help but be curious as to how Zheshio had broken through to ethereal opening last night and what he had endured in the process. Luo Luo suddenly looked at him and said seriously, "Teacher, after you go to the Garden of Zhou and see Master's wife, you cannot be soft-hearted." Only now did Qin Changsheng remember that she had previously said that Su Yurong would go to the Garden of Zhou. Many years had passed since the White Crane message. He didn't have any feelings for Su Yurong, nor did he care about her. Even the disgust he had felt before had not been completely dispelled. However, when he thought about the possibility of actually meeting her, for some reason, he felt indescribably nervous. He just didn't understand why Luo Luo would say such things. As soon as I finished writing, Luo Luo felt refreshed. It was faster than I had imagined. Su Yurong is about to enter the stage. Chen's nervousness is my nervousness. In the future, I will try to finish my updates before 11 o'clock, so as to not disturb everyone's rest. I will now go write tomorrow's draft. See you tomorrow. Chapter 237. Chun Changxing looked at Luo Luo in confusion and asked, "What do you mean by soft-hearted?" Luo Luo looked at him and sighed, saying, "Su Yurong is the successor of Holy Maiden Peak, deeply doted on by the Empress, even bringing good fortune to her father. And after the grand examination, everyone knows that Sir is the person chosen by His Holiness the Pope. In the current situation, you and she are naturally opponents." Qin Changsheng still did not understand. He thought, when leaving the mausoleum of books, Gohanshi had even said that opponents could take care of each other. How could she be soft-hearted? Luo Luo continued, "Whether or not the Garden of Zhou has Zhou Dufu's legacy or some other divine weapon or technique, in the end, it all depends on who moves faster and who is stronger." Qin Changxing thought that if Tang 36 was present, he would probably say, "Isn't it the virtuous who gets it?" Thinking of that guy's expression, he couldn't help but laugh. Lualua's small face was solemn. "Sir, can you be a little more serious? I'm not joking." Qin Changxing hurriedly apologized and asked, "Is it possible to steal from each other in the Garden of Zhou?" Luo Luo said, "As long as no lives are lost, no one can say anything, so you can't be soft-hearted." Qin Changsheng was silent for a while, then asked, and then, "Sir, you are very sentimental, and when you meet a girl, you are at a loss." Luo Luo looked at him and said seriously, "You and Master's wife are old friends, and she's so beautiful. I'm just worried that when you meet her in the Garden of Zhou, you won't need her to do anything. As long as she softly says a few words, you will completely listen to her." Qin Changxing thought, "I don't even know what Zirong looks like, so how could I have any old feelings?" He unwillingly replied, "The man you describe is so infuriating. How could it be me?" Luo Luo thought, "I was just acting like a spoiled child, and you couldn't do anything to me. Now you're so stubborn." But thinking of her dignity as a teacher, she did not directly expose Qin Changxing's weak defenses. She said sincerely, "In any case, you have to remember, the more beautiful a girl is, the more likely she is to deceive." Qin Changsheng looked at her and smiled. "How come a beautiful girl like you has never deceived me?" Luo Luo was startled at first, and then she giggled. She hit him and happily said, "Sir, you've been with Tang Tang for a long time, and you've become more and more eloquent." She looked very happy, but in fact, she felt a little guilty. She thought, that if her husband knew that she was actually the same age as him, would he think that she had been lying to him? Due to his guilty conscience, he couldn't control the strength of his fists. The tree trunk was very slippery after the rain, and Chen Changsheng almost fell down. Luo Luo hurriedly grabbed hold of him. Her eyes turned slightly, and she very quickly changed the topic. Putting on a wronged expression, she said, "Sir, I also want to enter ethereal opening." Chen Changsheng couldn't stand this kind of situation the most. He was slightly flustered and hurriedly consoled. "Didn't I say before that many ethereal opening cultivators might not be able to defeat you? For example, me." Luo Luo thought about how he was about to go on a long journey again, and would not be able to hear such warm comfort in a short period of time. She actually felt wronged and said, "The problem is that I can't enter ethereal opening, so I can't go with teacher to the garden of Zhou." Chen Changsheng thought about it and said, "Even if you've completed your ethereal opening, could it be that the Divine Empress and His Holiness will allow you to risk your life in the garden of Zhou?" Even Guardian Jean wouldn't agree. Luo Luo sighed and said, "Sir, your words really don't sound like comforting words." Chen Changsheng felt a little ashamed and said, "I'm really not good at this." "Sir, if it's not to see Master's wife, then why do you want to go to the garden of Zhou?" Luo Luo suddenly asked seriously. She knew that Chen Changsheng was a person who treasured his time, but he always paid attention to the natural nature of his heart. Leaving the mausoleum of books to go to the garden of Zhou, this choice, no matter how she looked at it, was filled with a sense of urgency. Chen Changsheng was silent for a while. He extended his hand and rubbed her head, but didn't give any explanation. Luo Luo also didn't ask any more questions. The spring rain was like a thread, blown in all directions by the lake wind. It fell on their faces and bodies, slightly dampening, but not at all embarrassing. Chen Changsheng extended his hand and pushed a strand of wet hair from her eyes to the side. Luo Luo looked at him and smiled. Chen Changsheng also smiled. Luo Luo said, "Sir, in a moment, come with me to Li Palace. His Holiness wants to see you." The smile on Chen Changsheng's face instantly disappeared. In the evening, a carriage drove out of 100 Flowers Lane and arrived in front of Li Palace. Luo Luo, under the protection of a dozen demi-human experts and orthodoxy priests, followed the Divine Avenue between Temple Seminary and Li Palace College, continuing on the carriage towards the Hall of Clear Virtue. Chen Changsheng, under the guidance of 2 bishops, followed a divine avenue that he had never stepped on before, heading towards the main hall of Li Palace. The setting sun was like blood, but it didn't have the aura of a powerful army, only solemnity. The priests and scholars walking on the divine avenue recognized his identity and gave way to him. Today, the entire continent already knew that this new student of Orthodox Academy, who had caused a ruckus in the capital last year, was the person chosen by His Holiness. Of course, he himself was famous. Su Yurong's fiancé, first upon the first banner in the grand examination, no matter which title, had the right to attract the attention of all. Not to mention that not too long ago he had viewed all the monoliths of the front mausoleum in one day in the mausoleum of books, and last night he had bathed the entire capital in starlight. Several hundred gazes looked at Chen Changsheng on the Divine Avenue. The emotions in those gazes were very complex: shock, admiration, envy, and even reverence. Yes, the current him finally had the right to make others feel reverence. It wasn't in terms of cultivation level or strength, but rather the talent and background he had displayed. Chen Changsheng's current mood was also very complex. From the moment the grand examination had been announced, he knew that there would be a day when he would be summoned by His Holiness. But he didn't think that this day would arrive so quickly. He had just left the mausoleum of books and had already arrived at Li Palace. This made him a little unprepared. He nervously thought about what questions he should ask later to ensure that he would receive an answer, and then not be beaten to death by the staff. Walking under countless gazes, This made the divine avenue seem very long. Previously, he was a little unaccustomed to it, but now he was very thankful, because this gave him enough time to organize those questions. No matter how long the divine avenue was, it would eventually come to an end. Door after door was pushed open, the twilight deepened, and the palace also deepened, until he arrived at the incomparably grand main hall. Standing in the middle of dozens of statues of previous saints and knights, feeling that dignified aura of light, Qin Changsheng was shocked speechless. But before he had the time to experience it more, he was brought to a side hall to the side of the main hall. The eaves of the palace here extended a much longer distance than normal palaces, so the sunlight was largely obscured. Not to mention that it was now dusk. Even if it was noon, this place would still be very quiet and secluded. Not to mention that it was now dusk. The two bishops quietly retreated, leaving Chen Changsheng standing alone in front of the stone steps. There was no one else in this main hall, so he could see His Holiness at a glance. His Holiness was an old man. He didn't wear a crown, nor did he hold a staff. He wore a hemp gown and was currently watering a pot of green leaves. This tall and thin old man couldn't be described with the words high position and heavy position, because he had long surpassed the concept of power and influence. The next chapter before 10:30. Chapter 238. The Pope was a saint. He only needed to say one word, and there would be millions of believers of the orthodoxy willing to die for him. Qin Changsheng didn't know what the Pope's first words were. He was a bit nervous. Then he heard 3 words. Come, come, come. The Pope beckoned to him, indicating for him to enter the hall. It was like a farmer calling his chick, or a grandfather teasing his grandson. Qin Changsheng stared blankly, then followed the stone steps into the hall, standing by the Pope's side. The Pope was right in front of him. This fact made him incomparably nervous. Even though he had seen many important figures after coming to the capital, some of them even being legends, he still found it hard to control his emotions. After all, this tall and thin old man was the Pope. The Pope, while watering the green leaf-potted plant, pointed at a chair and said, "Sit." His voice was very gentle, his demeanor very casual. Qin Changsheng sat on the chair, feeling as if he was sitting on pins and needles. His entire body felt uncomfortable, yet he didn't dare to move. Be more casual. The Pope looked at his appearance, smiled, and said, "I know you have many questions in your heart. To save some time, I'll speak first. If there's anything you don't understand, or if there's anything you want to ask, you can directly ask me. If it's convenient for me to answer, I'll naturally answer you." Finishing this sentence, his hand left the wooden ladle, smiled, and said, "I'll speak first and answer afterwards. It'll take about 200 breaths of time. I think you can still endure it." Qin Changsheng knew that the Pope was referring to his current sitting posture being very difficult. He couldn't help but feel a bit embarrassed, respectfully nodding his head. Without any preamble, without any foreshadowing, the Pope began his own narration. "Your teacher is called Taoist Ji. He also has another identity. He was once the principal of the Orthodox Academy, which is also my senior. You don't need to look at me like that. I'm very sure that he only has these 2 identities, because the most likely third identity was already eliminated by me and the Empress a while ago. In other words, you are my martial nephew. There has always been a saying outside the Li Palace that Tianhaier is my successor, but that is not true. I do not have a true successor. So, in other words, you're the only successor of our sect. So it is only natural that I look after you. I have a grudge against your master, a huge grudge. I killed him once, but I didn't expect him to survive. I'm already so old now, and I can't be bothered to kill him again. Besides, just because he made a mistake doesn't mean that you are also in the wrong. You shouldn't be the one to bear the responsibility. He agreed to let you enter the capital to break off the engagement. He did not deliberately conceal the name of Taoist Ji, which means that he did not intend to hide it from us. In fact, I think that he wanted me to look after you. But you entering the Orthodox Academy was truly just a coincidence. Letting you enter the Tong Palace was because I had Mou take you there. Why can I make her move? Because I am the Pope. Staying in the Tong Palace for a night can avoid the storm of the Ivy League gathering. With the Bureau of Traditional Education watching, entering the 3 grades in the grand examination isn't too difficult. But I didn't think that you would get to know Princess Luo Luo and even become her teacher. I didn't think that the stagnant Orthodox Academy would actually be able to cause such a huge commotion. I didn't think that you would be able to leave the Tong Palace, face the storm of the Lee Mountain Sword Sect at the Ivy League gathering, break into ethereal opening at the grand examination, and actually obtain first upon the first banner. Saying this, His Holiness paused for a moment, looked at him lovingly, and said, "What I didn't think of the most, and what I should have thought of the most, is that since you are the only successor of our sect, why would you need my care or my arrangements? Not bad. This child of yours is truly not bad." The palace hall was silent. From the moment His Holiness spoke his first words, Qin Changsheng's mouth had been wide open due to shock and had never closed it again. Orthodox Academy had always been under the care of the Bureau of Traditional Education. At the very beginning, including him, many people thought that this was a silent protest by the Orthodoxy's conservative faction towards His Holiness and the Divine Queen, as well as some sort of symbolic declaration. It wasn't until the battle for the grand examination, when the Tower of Purging Dust was rained several times and His Holiness personally crowned him with the laurel, did people realize that this wasn't an internal affair of the Orthodoxy, but rather a declaration made by the Orthodoxy to the Divine Queen and the Zhou dynasty. From that moment on, Chen Changsheng had many guesses as to why His Holiness valued him so much. He was very sure that this value had something to do with his master, but no matter how he thought about it, he couldn't have imagined that the extremely unremarkable middle-aged Taoist in Xining Village's old temple was actually His Holiness Senior, the last principal of Orthodox Academy that had been reduced to ruins over 10 years ago. If you have anything to ask, then start asking. His Holiness picked up a handkerchief from the table and wiped his hands, casually saying this. Before this conversation had started, according to Qin Changsheng's imagination, for an important figure like His Holiness, his words would definitely be shrouded in mist, his words cryptic and profound, hiding countless deep meanings. He would need to be carefully pondered in order to comprehend the truth. Who would have thought that His Holiness would so simply and cleanly explain everything? The bright moon and cool breeze felt refreshed. All the questions he had on the divine avenue had all been answered. He didn't know what else he wanted to ask until he remembered the few details in His Holiness' words. He said with a serious expression, "You said that my master made a mistake. What mistake?" His Holiness said, "That year he went against the Orthodoxy's Great Radiance Assembly's decision, supporting the Chen royal clan in opposing the Divine Queen, bringing the entire Orthodox Academy and even more people into that abyss. The citizens of the Zhou dynasty supporting the Chen royal clan was a matter of course. What mistake was there?" Qin Changsheng said without hesitation, "That's not a mistake." At that time, only the Divine Queen's ascension to the throne could stabilize the government. Otherwise, the Zhou dynasty would be divided, the flames of war would be incessant, and the demon race would take advantage of the situation to invade the south. No matter if the starting point or goal of a choice was correct or not, in the eyes of us old people, as long as it affects the overall situation of humanity against the demon race, then it's a mistake. The Pope looked at him and calmly said, "It has already been several hundred years since that war. For a child your age, there are very few people who have seen the demons with their own eyes, and it is even more difficult to imagine the tragic scene of the continent. If you knew, then you would believe that our decision was correct." Qin Changsheng was young, but he was never one to be easily convinced. He directly asked, "Then what about now? You and the Divine Queen are gradually drifting apart. Aren't you afraid of affecting the overall situation against the demon race?" "I've known the Divine Queen for several hundred years. I know what kind of person she is, therefore I have no objections to her ruling the Zhou dynasty. The problem is, no one can live forever. The entire continent must consider how the human world will live after her. His Holiness seemed to have thought of something. His expression became a little emotional. He slowly said, "If the Tian Hai family can produce a second divine queen, then what harm is there in replacing the royal Qin family? The problem is the Tian Hai family can't produce a second divine queen. Then the royal Qin family must eventually return to their position." Chun Changsheng listened to these words and was silent for a long time. He then asked, "Even so, I still don't understand. How did my master guess that you would change your mind?" "Your master agreed to let you come to the capital to cancel the marriage, because he wanted to use your existence to tell me that he is still alive, and also to remind me that you are the only successor of our school." His Holiness repeated what he said before. He said, "No matter if I change my mind or not, I still have to take care of you. Otherwise, wouldn't the inheritance be broken? Your master is the person who understands me the most in the world. So regarding this point, your master understands it better than anyone else." Chun Changxing's expression was a little confused. Until now, he still couldn't connect the middle-aged Taoist in the old temple of Xining village with the famous principal of the Tradition Academy. Then he thought of something. His Holiness said that taking care of him was to continue the inheritance of their school. But he came from the Heavenly Academy, and his master came from the Tradition Academy. How did they become the same school? Which sect did they belong to? He uttered the question. Heavenly Academy, Temple Seminary, Tradition Academy, 13 divisions of Radiant Green, Lee Palace College. Besides Star-Picking Academy, the 6 ivies of the capital are the places where the orthodoxy trains the next generation. And the only people who practiced the orthodoxy in the past were me and your master. The so-called inheritance naturally refers to the inheritance of the orthodoxy. His Holiness looked at him and calmly said, "That year, your master almost broke the inheritance of the orthodoxy. Now you have the responsibility to continue this inheritance." Hearing this, Chun Changsheng's face instantly paled. He couldn't say anything for a long time. This didn't mean that his mental state was too weak. The main thing was that this news was too shocking. The sole successor of the orthodoxy, no matter who it was, to suddenly know that they had the possibility of becoming the next pope, they would be shocked speechless. Even the craziest painted armor Xiaozhang was no exception. Not to mention that Chun Changsheng was only a 15-year-old youth. The hall was silent. The wooden ladle floated in the air, slightly tilted, constantly pouring water into the basin. The water was like silver. The green leaves in the basin slightly trembled. A few sparkling and translucent droplets of water could be seen on the surface. After an unknown amount of time, he awoke from his shock, looked towards His Holiness, and asked, "This shouldn't be something that I need to consider in the near future, right?" His voice was very dry and hoarse, somewhat unpleasant to hear. It was clearly caused by nervousness. Mei Li Sha and I were worried that the pressure we put on you would be too great, that you might collapse before you matured. But now it seems that we were worrying too much. His Holiness quietly looked at him. His 2 eyes were calm and deep, as if they could see through everything. Chun Changsheng felt that all the secrets of his body and soul had nowhere to hide. This feeling made him very uncomfortable. Fortunately, in the next moment, His Holiness shifted his gaze, extended his hand into the air, and grasped the ladle. 200 breaths of time had passed. The water in the ladle had been emptied. The question and answer session concluded. It was time for Chun Changsheng to leave. But he didn't want to leave. He had previously found that he had no questions to ask. But now he remembered. There were still many things that he wanted to know. For example, the mausoleum of books, for example, the garden of Zhou, for example, the stars, for example, the orthodoxy,